Welcome back to the Data Driven Strength Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 9. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Zach Robinson. How are we doing today, Zach?
Doing great.
Doing great?
Yeah.
Anything on your mind? Anything
Just trying to think.
particularly irk you recently? Particularly excite you recently?
Yeah, I had a colleague that was, running a little behind today. That was a little tough,
Yeah. I'm always running a little bit behind, but
yeah,
today
it's Josh Pellin time. It's a running joke. There's like a little bit of that time optimism that seeks into whatever the time is, which is hilarious because it's just such a not congruent aspect of your personality, which is what I find the best. That's the most funny part of it.
Yeah, I think it is. It's been passed down to me one way or the other, whether it
intentionally or unintentionally.
Whether it's something that is hereditary or that is behavioral that I've picked up over time. It doesn't come from a place of like. It comes from a place of time optimism and trying.
Yeah, it's not you're prioritizing your time over others.
Yeah,
it's just more so like let me get this one extra thing in.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
But today I had a better excuse.
Yeah. I'm just messing with you.
And this is what's been irking me. So that was one of those cases where I asked you a question just because I wanted you to ask it back about what's been irking me.
Oh yeah.
My gym merged with another gym.
Let's go.
So therefore the
monopolization, baby. Let's turn this to a political podcast. Let's go.
So now the membership I think is about double, and it definitely showed today. And I've now had 2 sessions since there's more people there.
Sure.
And today added about 30 minutes to my session. Normally a 60, 70-minute session, I think took me an hour 40.
What piece of equipment got bogged down?
So what I try to do is I try to make my sessions flexible in terms of what I can start with.
Sure.
So if I have 2 chest movements, I typically am not going to swap the order of those chest movements. But if you have non-pressing exercises, so I also trained back today, I also trained abs and calves. So I can kind of just see what's open and just kind of knock things out as they're open. And then as long as I keep the exercises for a given muscle in the right order, then tracking progression is still pretty good. And then what I also like to do is in between rest periods when I'm on a machine, just kind of go start warming up on another machine. Yeah. So I don't put my water bottle on that other machine and take it, but just
hop
on it quick, get some warm ups in so that when I'm ready to move to the machine, I can. Or if it's pin loaded, maybe I will knock out a set, that sort of thing. So long story short, what was the question?
What piece of equipment slowed you down the most?
Equipment?
Yeah.
So today it was the lat pull down because
the infamous.
There are 4 lat pull downs at the gym. Only one of them is tall enough for me, and the other one's I run out of range of motion around I probably have it cuts off my range of motion by probably 5 inches or so. And I get very particular about I don't like making swaps.
Yeah, baby.
Do you like to make swaps?
I'm pretty flowy, but I don't think that's a good trait necessarily.
So I've been thinking about that because my fiance, when I got home from the gym and I stopped at home and then I rushed here, she's like, "You got to change gyms." She's like, "You can't be coming back from the gym every day and
upset."
She's like, I think you got to change gyms."
Yeah.
I'm so upset because
I know you like that gym.
I really like the gym, man.
It's unfortunate.
The equipment's good. There's also Redcon near us, which some people have heard of, the supplement company.
Sure.
Redcon. I think Redcon is even in Walmart and stuff. They're pretty pretty well known these days. And there's a Redcon gym near us in the area.
Yeah.
And they have really good equipment, but that place gets busy.
Yep.
And this gym was like a diamond in the rough. Because if you Googled gym near me, it wouldn't show up for the longest time. But it's like an artist that you
SoundCloud rapper.
It's like a SoundCloud rapper that ends up really taking off, and you really feel upset because it's man, this was my guy or gal, and now everyone knows about them. Now it's like, tickets for the shows are like 3 times as much. Yeah. So I'm down bad right now. Yeah. That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't like, I think about that a lot, honestly. Like, I used to be, I think for a variety of reasons, I've become more flexible with training, some of which are good reasons, some of which are bad reasons, and just like working around things. But yeah, that's something I ask myself a lot on, like, what is the optimal amount of neuroticism? Like, people talk about neuroticism in a negative connotation a lot of the times, but I was having this conversation with a client recently, actually, and I think neuroticism isn't necessarily always a negative trait. I think it can have some positive manifestations of that, but when it goes too far, obviously any personality trait can kind of be debilitating in some ways. But yeah, it's a tough one.
We're not psychologists, but we could dive into like conscientiousness versus neuroticism.
Yeah. Well, I listened to Jordan Peterson once, so I think I'm pretty much good.
Yeah, you're good. I think this is going to be, I'm trying to reframe this as like, okay, more people around me enjoying the iron. You have to ask to work in with more people as a result.
Consequentialism there, baby. Let's go. Yeah. Gym closes, it means gyms are popular. You know?
There's a positive way to frame it. It's a good way to practice. Like, okay, I really did, as like silly as it sounds, I did put a lot of thought and effort into like setting things up so I could be very consistent with like what exercises I'm using, and like finding the gym and finding the times of day that were the most reasonable to go to that gym. Yeah. And now it's kind of changed, but it's like, it's just a good example of no matter what you try to control, you're just like one step away from the next thing that's annoying. Yeah. So it'll be like something that popped into my head is perhaps I have one exercise per muscle group.
Indicator exercise.
Yeah.
That's what I think about too.
So basically what Zach is saying is one exercise per muscle per session where you do at least 2 sets of it or something. And that you can actually track progression on, and then you just fill in the rest of the volume that you want to get in that day, and you can be more flexible, or maybe you choose from 2 or 3 exercises so you can loosely track it.
That's where like the iron purists, I think, just it's not a theoretical advantage, it's just a logistical advantage. Like, pretty much anywhere you go, you're going to be able to get plates, a barbell, and dumbbells. Yeah. So like having those kind of evergreen indicator exercises, although on theoretical grounds sometimes are worse, I think from that perspective can sometimes you can do them in a way to make them better and those kind of things. But yeah, it's a interesting intersection of like, if you have all day to train, those kind of things. You
own your own gym.
Yeah, you can make it work. I'm using this Prime chest press with
I did fantasize about opening our training facility.
Yeah. Hey, it's always in the back. Something else I've been really interested in is like getting into like equipment manufacturing. We've talked about that a couple of times. I think that'd also be pretty cool. But hey, if anybody wants to hear our probably half-baked takes that are probably wrong, hit us up.
Hit us up. Make us some equipment and just send us all the prototypes, and we could choose our favorite.
There you
go. If you could also supply some funds so we can buy a place to put it, that'd be great. Also, I made a terrible mistake of wearing data-driven strength gear to the gym. I wear DDS gear a decent amount just because I like it, and we've worked with like a designer to get some of the designs. I dig them. I like putting on like a DDS shirt to like do DDS related work. It makes me like feel like I'm like putting on my uniform. But I wore a DDS stringer. It's more of a tank top today. And that also bogged me down a little bit because a couple people asked. For some reason, it does kind of like catch people's eyes. They're like, oh, like I had this was probably, honestly, might have been the last time I wore DDS gear to the gym regularly was at the gym I went to before this. And some guy asked me if I worked in like data science or something like that. So I think it like catches people's eyes a little bit. But anyway, I had 2 people be like, oh, I've seen your stuff online. So if this is what we get at 10,000 YouTube subscribers.
Oh, man.
Where like some people that I've seen before.
We're the SoundCloud rappers right now.
We're the SoundCloud rappers. Wait till we get to 11,000 subscribers. Right. Once we cross 11,000, we can't leave. But I couldn't imagine like our like how many people know about us is such a small fraction of other people in the field. That would kind of suck.
Yeah.
What do you think? Like,
you're saying like being extremely well known?
Yeah.
Oh, that terrifies me, to be totally honest. Like that's not something that suits my personality very well. But we do our best. Like I think. Yeah, it's like an interesting place of like I obviously want us to be quote unquote successful and grow. I was actually reading the comments the other day, and somebody was telling us all these things that we want to change to. I can't remember the exact phrasing they used, but like blow up is essentially what they were getting at in terms of like social media growth. And a couple of our followers were like kind of commenting that's like not necessarily the approach that we take, which was cool to see that they kind of
like someone will make a comment like, hey, if you want this to take off for pop science, do this. And then someone will respond like, that's not really the goal. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's just like, that's like the two wolves metaphor. And like in the back of my head is always like the balance, right? Is like, I think we obviously have good information. You know, we think this is worthwhile doing to communicate things and think we provide some sort of perspective that's worth listening to. But at the same time, there are ways that go against my internal ethics on like how to best do that. Yeah. And it's just a weird game to play.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of our thumbnails, like there are things I probably would have been like, no, let's not do that like a couple years ago.
Yeah.
It's just a typical push and pull. And that's also for that reason I look at like thumbnails or I look at content approaches of people that are like science or science adjacent these days. And I pass less judgment
100%,
because I understand the difficulty of that. Like there are arguments for being more rigid in your boundaries, if you will, in terms of like overstating claims or clickbait, whatever. But also it's like that's just just kind of is what it is to some degree. So like I pass less judgment on that.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer. Tough. It's just it's one of those things that it's always something I'm balancing in the back of my brain. But yeah, to answer your question,
10,000 subscribers is perfect.
Yeah, it's great. It's awesome. Yeah, I'm enjoying it.
Yeah,
I can walk around and be totally fine, anonymous.
And I've had clearly zero time to think about this because I literally just trained and I was just running late and we just started recording. But I'm realizing that like I already fully have systems for accounting for what I ran into today that I have in place for my clients, specifically hypertrophy clients. It's a little bit different for powerlifters.
Yeah.
But for hypertrophy clients, I literally have started as of probably the last couple months. Every single slot says like let's say I want them to do a hack squat. It'll be a drop down. It'll say hack squat, and then the second option will be other squat pattern.
No,
because it's just kind of streamlined some of the tracking for me because those things happen, and where you have to use a different piece of equipment for one reason or another at your gym or you're traveling or whatever. So it streamlines it to just say, hey, I used a different piece of equipment here. I can still track it. I can still indicate that I adhered to the program, but it's not really that helpful to look at the data for today. So it's kind of best of both worlds. It's like I literally have systems. If it's so funny to reflect on things that if I were to ask myself as a coach how I would answer it versus when it's yourself. So that's just something that popped in mind. Is like it wouldn't have been a big deal for me to go use the machine lat pull down as opposed to my normal lat pull down.
Yeah, and I also think about like what's the theoretical downside, and me, for reasons I won't go into because it'd be way too much of a tangent, but I've kind of had to restart training here recently for like kind of getting my wheels back churning and everything. And I had a very, very strong experience what being not neuromuscularly coordinated for an exercise felt like for the first time in a while. And my hot take is that is like the big concern about like swapping exercises. Like I'm going to be learning neurally. You're not going to get the same hypertrophy stimulus. My hot take is you're definitely going to know when that's happening. Today, I reached failure I was 100% sure that my muscle had, additional reps in the tank, but like I just didn't.
Was it a free weight movement compound?
Bunch of different movements. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Like
everything.
Like the single joint exercises are obviously a little bit easier, but that's kind of the point. Is like I think that your neuromuscular efficiency for different kind of movement patterns I think that's a lot more of a durable quality than I think people realize. And if you aren't able to, reach task failure because of the musculature you're trying to train, I think you're going to kind of know that if you have been around the gym for a little bit. Now, obviously, that's speculation. I don't have a citation next to this, but I don't know. That's been my current thinking is like, I don't think it's an insidious thing. Obviously, having the indicator exercise is helpful, but for the most part, and we've talked about this a couple different times, like I really just focus on the inputs at this point for the most part.
Yeah, I would love to chat this out a little bit further.
Yeah.
This is a segment that I jotted down as an idea, but we don't have on the outline, so maybe we'll
skip it, table it.
We'll table it, but let me just give a little bit of a preview because I want to.
Sure.
Your quick thoughts on this is like some of the kind of returning back to some of the more performance-oriented elements of hypertrophy training, specifically things that do enhance performance. So, like not having excessive mental fatigue going into a training session. Various supplements that can enhance how many reps you can get at a certain load. We could all imagine things related to training environment or music that also impact that. And you were kind of, and then another one is I do think settling into an exercise can have a pretty big impact on your performance independent of actual strength gain. Sure. So that would be like a neuromuscular improvement. Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting that you were saying, hey, my hot take is like you're going to know if you're not efficient enough on the exercise to maximize the stimulus.
Yeah.
Whereas if anything, my experience recently is my current mesocycle has been pushed to like 9-10 weeks, same exercises, basically to failure in almost every single set. And I'm continuing to improve. So part of my thinking is, man, I wonder if the stimulus is just considerably better now than it was in, say, week 3 or 4, where I was still training to failure, but I wasn't as settled into the movements.
I think both can be true. I guess what I'm describing is, like, the way I sometimes hear people describe it is like it's like a categorical, this is not good hypertrophy training. I think that you'll know. And like today, I don't think I got an optimal hypertrophy stimulus. Like there's just no way. But the case you're describing is it's not the exact same thing, but like what I'm hearing you say and what my experience kind of leads to is like essentially different exercises within the exercise. That's kind of how I think about it is like, yes, that's like a neuromuscular quality, but I also think that's just like, there's an aspect of that that's going to happen every block as you kind of get a feel for an exercise, but I also think that's just something that is kind of like part of training skill too. Yeah. New gym, new piece of equipment. I kind of have to groove it this way. I feel like if you'd rotate that exercise out and come back a couple mesos later, I think you'd probably have a good amount of that still if you still have those patterns. But I agree with what you're saying, and I still think that's where these are all the aspects that are going to take you from 95 to 100. Yeah. And I think those are the things that those are all the training skill qualities that we talk about that just consistently improve the efficiency of every set that you're performing. That's why the programming things can change a little bit.
And also part of that training skill is just like also accepting non-optimality and saying I'm not gonna like get upset about this and I'm just gonna stay focused and execute what I can do the best I can. I actually returned to an Iron Culture podcast. Man, it might have been like a 2018 episode with Brian Whitaker.
Oh, nice. Optimize within the constraints.
Exactly.
I love that phrase.
So do a search for Brian Whitaker Iron Culture if this resonated with you, because very successful natural bodybuilder. He looked insane on stage. And it's refreshing to hear him because he's, if I'm not mistaken, a full-time professor. I think at Oklahoma.
Economics, I think.
In economics, he has a family. And he's very clear about his, those go above training. Yeah. But he was obviously still able to be very, very successful. Whereas I think some flavor of lifters get, to return to what you said, very neurotic about it. And there's maybe like a healthy amount of that, of crossing your T's, dotting your I's, checking your boxes. But if you just can't, and you're doing double damage by being ticked off about it, and then that changing your effort elsewhere.
Exactly.
So there's an area of opportunity for you, boy, in terms of training skill. Last thing I'll say is, when training for hypertrophy, how much do you get fired up about like the performance of the set? Like, what do you get fired up about with hypertrophy training?
Hypertrophy specifically, I mean, always my driver training has been like I don't know if I can do this. That's always been just the thing that lights my brain up. Yeah.
Me too.
Even when I was younger, like that's always been just the part of it that I think it's just because I strive so hard for like general athleticism. And that's was my background for training, and just like those objective things like 40 time vertical jump, those like kind of things. And I wanted to progress so badly in those kind of things. And I thought that would take me there. For hypertrophy training in particular, I think now, particularly as I've gotten older, I think I chase much more just the experience of the set and the positive things that gives me, kind of detached from the performance. At least for me, for hypertrophy training, it's basically like, hey, this is really hard. I enjoy doing hard things, but it also just makes me feel good afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I kind of do it for the sake of doing it in a way.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good thing.
And I have to remind myself that every now and again. Like, it's tough. Like, you start making a little bit of progress, you know, your lifts start going up, then you start getting a little bit more objective focus. But for me, particularly with a bunch of the hurdles I've dealt with in the last, couple of years of my life, I've had to reframe it to be like, what is a sustainable relationship with this that's going to be evergreen for me? Because I've struggled. The double-edged sword of being so performance focused is when you're not improving your performance or can't chase those goals, you don't want to train. And that's what happened to me. So I've tried to reframe it more so that is a manifestation or a emergent property of doing the thing that I enjoy. And that's just a sweet cherry on top, as opposed to like, this is what I'm chasing, because that's like destructive.
And that day is gonna come, whether that is temporary or permanent, earlier in life, or it's the day is gonna come where age does catch up to you.
Exactly.
Now, a lot of people, I think that occurs maybe earlier than it does, but nonetheless, you're gonna get in your 70s or 80s plus at some point, and you're probably gonna hit your last PR at some point, but you should still lift. And if you're performance oriented or outcome oriented completely, it's really hard. Because I was also reflecting on that a little bit. I was like, that's what's getting me really fired up, is like beating what I hit last week by a rep.
It's hilarious.
And if that's the driving thing.
We've had this conversation before, and I definitely made the argument that I would struggle to lift if I don't have like an ability to make progress. And it's hilarious because I ended up having to go through that. And just like facing,
maybe we've swapped
facing that dragon earlier. No, I think it's like basically that conversation was just interesting because it was like foreshadowing essentially of like, this is how I thought about it. And then I reached a point where I was like, oh man, like
forced you to
I have to have this conversation with myself now. And it's been it sucks to like kind of take away that performance aspect for a little bit, but at the same time, it kind of makes you more glad when you can chase performance again. But it also, I think it just makes lifting more fun in a different way. Like a couple things that I've just noticed, this is way off, like we are off, but like just like one thing I've had a couple times, just enjoying a set of squats. Like it's weird. It's weird to even say that, but like I've had that now where it's like, this is fun. Cool. Like, just things like that. So it's, I think it definitely goes in waves. Like when you're able to like train progressively, you have a bunch of time, you're able to be in a surplus, those kind of things. It is naturally something you could focus more on. But I do think that's a helpful skill for anyone that's, wants to be kind of a lifelong lifter, of facing that dragon at some point, whether it's an injury, whether it's something else. Like just realizing that at the very beginning of this, for most of us, you were 16 at some gym in your hometown with the barbells that have tetanus on it, and you're hitting 21s or running the rack, and it's just, you're just there with your boys having fun.
I don't know. I know where you grew up, and I don't know what the bars I had on them when I started training, but
ours weren't pretty.
I love going back to the gym I first started training. I love doing that.
It's
but
different.
That gym also got insanely busy.
Really?
Insane.
Mine closed.
It closed?
Yeah. Sucks.
Dude, me and my best friend from high school, we would drive, except for during basketball season, we would drive from school to the gym every single day. We'd listen to Lil Uzi Vert or something. And when I listen to those songs by Lil Uzi Vert,
puts you in a different time.
Like it brings me back to those days, and it like refreshes me about like the reasons you get into training. Anyway,
First segment.
First segment. So we have a few segments for you today. No promises exactly what we'll get through, but we have some recent research on kind of rest pause / cluster set / myo-rep type training. Some discussions on what factors might influence individual level program design, how to practically apply different scales in terms of
Set
your effort in the gym. Yeah, set termination, whether that's reps in reserve or some other things we have up our sleeves, kind of on the practical side of things. Some errors you might make when interpreting studies, or maybe your favorite influencer makes when they interpret studies. And yeah, we'll see what we can get through. So with that, Zach, what's been on your mind recently with rest pause research?
Yeah, honestly, we've talked about this a few times, but I do really think that I don't know what you would call these, maybe like extended set techniques, maybe, or they used to be called like intensity techniques, but I don't know if I'd call it that. But let's
I actually really like extended sets.
Yeah.
So let's go with that.
So yeah, the umbrella term of like extended set techniques. So you got drop sets, rest pause, myo reps, cluster sets. All these kind of things kind of fit into the same bucket. And I still think like for both optimization crowd reasons, but also efficiency crowd reasons, I think this is like one of the most under-researched areas, because if we can essentially equate the stimulus or equate our results in a fraction of the time, that's either just going to make, getting the same stimulus way more efficient for somebody who's got a time cap, or for people who are looking to optimize things, potentially allows you to fit in more stimulus across the week and potentially reach even higher peaks. So I think just in general, this area of research is really interesting, but there was a recent study that you dug into a little bit here that I think sheds light on this topic even more.
Yeah. I really like how you teed it up as set extension methods. And I'll kind of frame this using two approaches that I think are the most common, but I'll also say that there are other approaches. The first is drop sets. So drop set would be you get to failure or close to failure with a given load. You drop the load by, say, anywhere from 20 to 60%. You run it back. You go closer to failure again, and you might even have multiple drops within there. So you're taking that first set and you're extending it because you're fatigued, you're dropping the load, and you're continuing to potentially accrue stimulus. The second approach is what I'll call rest pause. And rest pause training typically includes keeping the load the same. So if you get to failure or close to failure with the given load, you rest for a little bit so you can kind of allow some recovery to occur, and then you can squeeze out more reps. I'm going to purposefully conflate rest pause and myo reps here. So for our discussion, we'll kind of use those synonymously, even though I know that there are not all rest pause training is myo rep training, but I do think myo rep training is a form of rest pause training.
Yeah, that's how I've always viewed it.
That's how I viewed it.
Yeah.
But
I view them as the same thing, honestly.
Yeah.
Whatever.
But myo reps are a common way to approach that. So the way that I would program a myo rep protocol is you do one set and then you rest. It kind of depends on the exercise and it depends on the person, but anywhere from like 5 to 30 seconds, have them pick the weight up again, go to failure or to a certain number of RIR, and then you can potentially do that again and again. I'd say on average, I would ask someone to do like 3 mini sets. So 1 activation set and then 3 smaller mini sets with 7 or 5 to 30 seconds of rest before each mini set. So again, that's a set extension method where you have that activation set, but you're allowing some mini recovery in there to squeeze out some productive reps potentially. So that's kind of our 2 approaches is basically, do we drop the load and do drop sets, or do we do these mini rests and do rest pause? And there was a study that came out in, I think it was technically published in January of 2025 by Vargas Molina and colleagues. And I liked this study for a few reasons. And the reason is the way that they actually controlled the variables at play here. Okay. So the tricky thing when you're studying either one of these, whether it's drop sets or rest pause, is you kind of have 3 variables that are impossible to hold constant at the same time. Okay, so you have reps in reserve, or just the overall difficulty or effort of the set, how close to failure you get. you have total reps completed throughout the protocol, and you have the load used, right? Because you're going to compare this rest pause group to a traditional training group, right? And when you add in this kind of this set extension method, it just gets a little bit hazy because you want to equate as much as you can to the traditional group. So a common approach we see in rest pause training is that you equate the total reps and the load, but not RIR. So I'll give you a basic example. Let's say that you are in the traditional group and I'm in the rest pause group. Maybe you do a set of 10 reps with 75% of your 1 rep max. Awesome. That's maybe 2 RIR, something like that. And then if I'm in the rest pause group, I would also do 10 reps with 75% of my 1 rep max, but maybe I would rest a little bit between rep 5 and 6. So I'm kind of doing this rest pause approach, but you can imagine there that now that 10th rep with 75% of my 1 rep max is easier. It's further away from failure than Zach's is. So I kind of, sure, I was less fatigued in reps 6 through 10, but that fatigue might actually be a good thing. So long story short, it's tricky to study because depending on whether the main goal of the program is strength or hypertrophy.
That's a crucial difference.
Yeah, exactly. You might prioritize controlling or not controlling certain things. So it gets a little bit hazy. And what I liked about this study is that they did find a way to equate reps in reserve. Okay, so in other words, the reps in reserve at the end of each set or each like mini set was similar. This was at the expense of load. Okay, so what that means is that the group that trained with the rest pause protocol did use a heavier load. In my opinion, I think this is a good thing. I think if the main outcome the researchers are interested in is hypertrophy, I would like to see RIR equated. I don't want that rest pause group to just train further from failure as a result. So let's get into the specifics of the study a little bit so you can see how they actually did that. So they had 10 trained participants, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they did do a within study design such that one leg of each individual was in each group. So you can kind of think of it as 10 participants per group or 20 total legs included in the study. The study was 8 weeks long, 2 sessions per week, and they trained both the leg press and the leg extension. So how did they compare traditional straight sets to rest pause training? And how did they control for RIR? Again, I'm not going to say this design is perfect, but I also really liked I was really happy to see it in the research because it is a novel approach here and one that I think gives us some more practical implications for hypertrophy training. So the traditional group trained with 5 sets of 12. So 5 sets of 12 on each exercise twice a week, so 20 total sets in the traditional group. And the load was adjusted set to set to achieve 0 to 1 reps in reserve. So awesome. Really nice hypertrophy training design, training to or close to failure, good solid rest between sets, solid volumes, awesome. Great group for traditional. What they did in the rest pause side of each person's body is they also did 5 sets of 12. They also trained at 0 to 1 RIR, but they kind of treated each set of 12 as 3 mini sets of 4. So what they did is they did basically 3 clusters, you can think of it as. So they put on their 4 rep max load, hit 4 reps, rested 20 seconds, hit 4 more reps, rested 20 seconds, and hit 4 more reps. It does seem that they had to drop the load across those clusters. It wasn't entirely clear in the manuscript how exactly they did that, but they did emphasize the fact that those clusters were 0 to 1 reps in reserve, or at least pretty dang close to it, because that was the target, and that's how they were adjusting the load accordingly. So after they finished each set of 12, which was really 3 clusters of 4 reps, they rested for 3 minutes. So basically the programs were the exact same. The only difference is the rest pause group got 20 seconds of rest twice within each set. And as a result, they were able to use heavier loads. Does that generally make sense?
Yeah.
If it does, I can move into the results here.
Yeah, so just to quickly recap, total reps equated, sets equated in a way, and then proximity to failure is equated. The only thing that's different is the percentage of 1RM, which may be relevant for strength results if you get to that, but for hypertrophy, probably less of a concern.
Yeah, before we get to the results, this is why it's so tricky to study rest pause, is that it is proximity to failure equated. At the same time, the number of touches, the number of failure points, or the number of touches to 0 or 1 RIR is higher in the rest pause condition.
Yep.
So I know you've already seen the results of the study. In fact, I think you're the one that notified me when this was published. But let's imagine you had no knowledge of the study. Which would you anticipate would lead to more muscle growth?
I'm going two ways because I guess I'm thinking more deeply about the fact that it is more failure points now. I think off rip, the fact that their proximity to failure equated, I probably would have just said similar.
Yeah.
But it is counterintuitive if you view them as independent sets of 4 with a failure point at each one. That does seem marginally counterintuitive.
Yeah. That's kind of the way that I'm viewing it, is I would have a hard time imagining the rest pause group to do way worse.
Right.
Because let's say that even the rest pause doesn't work very well. But you're still training really hard for the first mini set or first cluster of 4 reps at the beginning of each set of 12. And you're resting sufficiently before that, such that I have a hard time imagining that set of 4 isn't just as good as the set of 12 that the other group was doing. So kind of the way that I view it is this a potential hack for your training, or a potential way to get more stimulus is just to use heavier loads, rest a little bit once you get to failure, and just knock out more sets with that heavy load as you go, or even slight drops as you go. It's messy when you think about designing a study like this.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm thinking now is how much. It's so funny. I would love to see a group that also equated the number of sets, but didn't do the additional clusters.
So 5 sets of 4.
Yeah, exactly. I would have loved to see that, just to see if it was what it was doing, because that's an interesting consideration.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go too far off the weeds here.
Long story short is the outcomes were pretty dang similar.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is exercise science. It is 10 participants per group. It is relatively limited assessments of muscle size. So specifically, they used DEXA to look at thigh segmental lean mass increases. And it was around 172 grams of lean mass increased for the traditional group, and about 200 grams of lean mass increased for the rest pause group. And that is, I think, somewhere in the 1/3 to half a pound of lean mass gained in the each thigh, which is quite a bit. So each group grew pretty well, it seems. Muscle thickness, unfortunately, was only measured for the rectus femoris, which is a bit of a bummer because the rectus femoris probably didn't get trained all that well from the leg press, but it probably did get trained pretty well from the leg extension. The traditional group increased their rectus femoris muscle thickness by about 0.17 centimeters, and the rest pause increased by about 0.24 centimeters. Don't read too much into the individual numbers I just mentioned. Long story short, we don't have any strong certainty one way or the other that one was better than the other. Of course, if we had 1,000 participants in the study, maybe there's a small difference. But I do think this serves as a nice proof of concept that they each can lead to meaningful muscle growth. And at least in small sample research like this, there doesn't seem to be an overwhelming difference between the two. So let's discuss what this means for your training and what we can actually draw from this. I don't think that finding fancy ways to artificially increase the number of failure points is going to be something I can practically recommend. So I do think it has theoretical rationale, such that, hey, if I'm doing a set of 10 to failure, why not just put my 5 rep max on there, go to failure, then rest a little bit, maybe drop the load a little bit, and then do another set of 5 to failure. I'm getting basically more effective reps. And I do think in a lot of ways, if you were to take some interpretations of like a stimulating reps or an effective reps model, you might suspect that the rest pause group in this study would have led to more muscle growth. Again, I think there might be theoretical rationale there, but from my read of the paper, from just thinking about how this protocol would have actually played out in the lab, I think the issue is going to be practical constraints, practical issues. This is a direct quote from the discussion. It said, "The joint and neural stress generated in the rest pause protocol may be one of the indicators that the total volume was not appreciably greater at the end of the 8-week study period." So basically what we saw is that even though they were able to train with higher loads and they were able to get more failure points, they weren't able to progress as well week to week. And they presumably had to drop the load a decent amount from mini set to mini set as they went. So I think there are just practical issues with trying to kind of artificially increase the failure points here. And I do think it's just kind of like a reminder of how tried and true straight set approaches are, traditional set approaches are. And I'll see what you think, and then we can move on to some practical recommendations.
My main question I'm asking myself is, what, to the extent that you think there is a drop, what's the drop in stimulus between those sets of 4 in the kind of the approach there? Like, I'm so curious how much they had to drop the load.
I wish the study reported it. They reported overall volume load for each exercise for each group, but that doesn't really tell us exactly what we want to know. Theoretically,
it's only 10 people. I know it's within the subject too. It should be theoretically higher for the cluster set group, right? Because you're
doing the same number of reps. So yeah, exactly. So that is indication that I guess you could do some back of the napkin math to kind of estimate it.
Sure. Like it looked, based on the visuals here, it looks like it is higher, but not by...
It's higher. It was only significant in some weeks.
A ton, yeah.
But yeah, to your point, I guess you could kind of ballpark it and potentially estimate that by the last cluster, the last mini set, they might have been using a lower load than the 12RM group was.
That's what I'm thinking. I don't know.
The traditional group.
It's interesting. It's interesting because the failure point thing really has me like kind of passing it through a second time in my mind.
Yeah.
Because if you view it from that perspective, they're essentially doing more sets if you count the sets of 4 as equivalent sets.
It is kind of like indirect evidence for rest periods mattering.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Because, in a way, they're doing...
Or that sets of 4 are...
I just have a hard time believing that, but maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just that's on the chopping block.
And I don't envy folks that have studied rest pause or drop sets, because it is tricky to kind of weigh out the pros and cons of everything. Because like on one hand, you do want some of these approaches to be more time efficient, because that's when people would use them. But yeah, it's just tricky to kind of choose what to control and what not to, because there's always kind of a give and take. Here's my recommendation overall, and I'll see if you're on board. My recommendation is to maximize the number of traditional sets you can do within your constraints. What do I mean by constraints? I mean your ability to kind of manage the fatigue from the set, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And secondly is time constraints. So a previous argument against rest pause type training or even drop set type training is that it causes more fatigue. And in my view, based on some other bodies of research we've discussed extensively on the show, that's probably less of an issue than we might have thought. So in other words, just because your fatigue the next day from doing rest pause or from doing drop set training will be higher, or some measures of muscle damage might be higher, or soreness might be higher. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. even if like the stimulus to fatigue ratio is a little bit lower. So in my opinion, what matters in terms of recovery is more within session. So I think that you should maximize your traditional sets within your constraints, and those constraints are, again, time and your ability to kind of manage your performance within a session such that it doesn't fall off so much. What does that mean? That means that if you're training quads, your first set of leg press should absolutely not be a drop set or a myo-rep or rest pause protocol, because you're probably going to take away quite a bit from the rest of your quad training in that day. Instead, I would put it near the end of sessions, and I would view rest pause or myo reps or drop sets as icing on the cake. So, for example, if you only have time to do one set for an exercise, one set for a muscle within a session, awesome. Do that one set, and then use a set extension method. Use myo reps, use drop sets to just extend that set and kind of get some icing on the cake. That one set's going to be very productive. You can do rest pause. You can do drop sets to just squeeze out a little bit more stimulus. And because you're only doing that one set anyway, you're not doing anything after that, and you're not going to disrupt the effectiveness of the rest of the session. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's kind of how I think about it too, is like in concept, the goal is to try to maximize the stimulus throughout the week. That obviously has a ton of different levers that we can pull within any one session. The ideal is that every set is fully recovered, which in theory is going to have the maximal stimulus for that individual set. And you're trying to accumulate a good amount of those. But if we're capped in some way, shape, or form, then you have to ask yourself the trade-off. What's better, having a lower amount of fully recovered sets or a similar amount of mostly fully recovered sets with a few of these set extension techniques thrown on? And I think so long as the recovery trade-off isn't absurd, I think these are a very good investment for most people, and can be applied in kind of a wide range of scenarios. But yeah, in general, putting those earlier in the workout is going to compromise things unnecessarily. So it's just kind of a logical step-down process of how do I increase the number of exposures or sets that I'm doing without tanking the overall performance of my session, just like you outlined.
Yeah, perfect. All right, now I'm curious, what do you use more often, rest pause or myo reps? Sorry,
drop sets?
Rest pause or drop sets?
I use rest pause more frequently. I don't have a super good rationale other than, for me, in my opinion, getting the drops right is tough, because if you go too much of an aggressive drop, I'm starting to doubt that the perception of discomfort isn't kind of blurring the lines of task failure anymore.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in that super fatigue state, it becomes increasingly more important if we kind of pull a little bit of the logical rationale for why it may be a little bit more important with lower loads. So point being, with these set extension techniques, I think proximity to failure is very important, if not paramount.
Yeah.
And so trying to organize the environment to try to make hitting that as likely or as feasible as possible is generally my go-to. And you also don't have to change the load if you're applying this to more exercises. So instead of just the selectorizer machines, if you're using myo reps or rest pause more generally, maybe you can throw that on a leg press, maybe you can throw that on a barbell. There's a few other applications that I think are a little bit more broad, and just like kind of getting good at that, I think is helpful. So that, generally speaking, is my go-to, is something in the range of, hit. And I think it's really good for generalizing to strength stuff as well. For hit one top set that's like pretty heavy, and then you can hit a couple extra additional reps with probably slightly different RIR prescriptions than you typically would do for hypertrophy. So point being, I think it's a little bit more user-friendly in terms of nailing the prescriptions. The only thing you have to be aware of is making sure the reps don't go out the bottom end. But I think that's a little bit easier to kind of navigate and help somebody through, whereas drop sets, I think, are a little bit more dependent on the exact parameters of the entire situation and take a little bit more know-how to make sure those get nailed.
Yeah, I just have never found drop sets to like feel sticky in my program. Yeah. What I mean by sticky is I'm like, yeah, this is definitely producing results, and it's also like practical, and I just therefore continue to do it. For whatever reason, they just haven't been sticky.
Yeah.
Could that be a blind spot? Sure. Is my ability to assess their actual effectiveness very limited, and I could be conflating it with other things? Absolutely. But I just haven't consistently prescribed them or done them myself. So that's just what I'll say on the front end. At the same time, even though I use, just like you, rest pause training more, I will say that the research on it is, at least for hypertrophy outcomes, so how we would design rest pause for hypertrophy training, there's just very little research. Honestly, this might be the closest study. I'd have to think back to some other ones. Like there's one by Ennis that's pretty solid.
Honestly, I more so think of, at least for me, rest pause is just an extension of the rest interval research. That's how I usually think about it. It's essentially saying that, yes, there's a small compromise that comes with very short rest intervals. You're kind of taking that on the chin, saying I'll do another extra set or so, but you're essentially keeping the load the same.
Or just almost flip it on its head. So some people view myo reps or rest pause as, I'm going to do this protocol instead of straight sets. And in order to do this protocol and make it as good as straight sets, I'm just going to do a little bit more because there is some research, if you extrapolate from other areas, that you would have to do more because those little mini sets or cluster sets are less effective, which I agree with. I think that makes total sense. However, from a practical perspective, I don't really view it as like comparing them. I view it as
it's a button you can press.
It's a button you can press to squeeze a little bit more stimulus with very little time. And that's a different lever than adding another straight set. So like I love to prescribe them on calves or abs because that's not the most fun training for a lot of people. So you can just rip the Band-Aid off in like 2 or 3 minutes for a myo rep protocol. And I kind of view it as like, it was one good set with set extension, so some extra stimulus sprinkled on there. That's honestly how I view it. I would need a lot of convincing for that to be the meat and potatoes of someone's program. I would say the only case I would go that route is when would just program a single set because that's all they have time for. I would just add some myo reps on there to kind of extend the set, squeeze some more stimulus out. That's how I view it, which is basically the same thing you said, maybe just coming at it from a different angle.
Yeah, I think if you can organize it in a way, basically to minimize the downsides, I think you organize it in a way that minimizes the performance decay as much as possible, but some of that is inevitable, and that's kind of the proxy of how much theoretical trade-off am I kind of giving up here. And like you said, I don't think I could really ever confidently say that's going to be equivalent to straight sets, although that probably is going to be really hard to detect. Just if you're going off the grounds of, performance has to be above a certain threshold to maximize the per set stimulus. I would tend to agree, but it's an easy. That's another reason why I like it, is that rest pause myo reps are easy to take an existing protocol and just say I'm going to press the myo rep button or short rest period button in kind of my case, and that's you're making that protocol more time efficient, probably sacrificing a little bit of a stimulus, but in theory, like it's a good trade-off. It's a worthwhile trade-off in my view.
Yeah. Drop sets just suck so bad too. Like if you actually push them hard,
that's my point. Like it just becomes feasibly challenging to reach task. Like people talk about the discomfort associated with one high rep set when you're doing 3, 4 in a row.
Even on a single joint movement for like a set of 10, I don't know. I do think there has been like some degree of overstating how hard it is to train to failure. At the same time, you kind of return to some experiences that you've had where you're like, there's always kind of another gear. And I want you to regularly tap into that gear is kind of my perspective. I think a way to do that is to like be consistent with your exercise selection, aim to progress, and you're going to kind of force yourself to get to that extra gear because you're pushing for progression. But the reason I bring that up is if you know you have to drop the load and go to the point of really high pain again, perhaps multiple times right after, man, I just have a hard time believing you wouldn't pace yourself. I do think pacing is something that occurs quite a bit in hypertrophy training that people just don't really acknowledge.
Yeah, that's you said basically what I was trying to articulate in a better way. It's not that I don't think you can reach the task failure, higher reps. I still, like you said, I think that is overstated sometimes. It is obviously more challenging the higher you get. But the other thing too is like we always talk about having a progressive mindset when you're training, and I think it becomes immensely more challenging to do that the longer the set kind of lasts. So you go into that set with focus and intent. If the set just lasts longer, I think that's like harder to maintain that. Like if you're trying to squeak out that extra rep at, let's say that, you're doing a double progression model or whatever, and it's like 10 to 20 and you're trying to get that 21st, 22nd rep, like you're taking a while to like get to that gear like you were talking about. Whereas if you're, more so in the 6 to 12 range or whatever like that, I just think that is a little bit more reasonable.
Yeah.
Cool.
With that, we can move on to segment number 2, and I think Colin's going to really like this one.
Oh, great.
Colin is the man. Shout out to Colin on the back end, always getting it right. So we talk about individualization a decent bit on the show, and if you've been listening for a while, you know that it's kind of gone back and forth in terms of like how, like with the angle we come at it from. I don't think we've ever held the position that like one size fits all in terms of program design. I don't think that would ever be the case. I just can't imagine a world where that is the case. But we have shifted our perspective quite a bit in terms of like why and how to individualize training. And I think this is a good opportunity to have a practical segment about what are the things that would actually change what you put on the program, because we regularly emphasize the importance of principles and the fact that those principles probably apply to you as well. You're probably not a special snowflake in terms of how your physiology responds to a change in a given variable.
Yep.
But we would still hold true that individualization is key. So Zach, tell us what are some of those factors with the principles in mind, actually applying those principles. How would that manifest into different programs for different folks?
Yeah, so in the process of painstakingly writing up my dissertation, which has been a long process that I'm sure we'll have the whole saga on another episode at some point, I've continuously come back to thinking about these practical things and like ultimately how a potentially slightly revised version of how individualization works, what it means, why we do it, how does that interface on how we actually coach, how we actually assign training programs. And this was a good opportunity to kind of reflect on that and think about the things that I think, you give me two twins essentially. And if you were able to kind of have like some avatar where you can kind of pull and prod on a few of these variables, they would tangibly influence the way that we would actually write a training program for somebody. I guess the first thing to say is what isn't the case, probably to start. Again, we'll have a full-length discussion on this at some point, but I think the biggest thing that I would probably say at this point in time, which again is subject to change with more evidence, et cetera, that goes without saying, but I think, and this is going to sound like a non-controversial statement, but I think what it means is something that's very important, is that I do think the principles and the kind of concepts that we derive training programs from are kind of evergreen qualities that kind of apply to everyone. And so what I mean by that is just the general physiological principles of how the training variables interact with different outcomes. Probably at risk of being a dead horse, generally speaking, more volume is going to lead to greater muscle growth. We can debate on what that exact relationship looks like, but let's just take that as a principle. I think that is happening. That principle is occurring under the hood for everybody. Mm-hmm. But the way that actually is going to manifest on an individual training program requires a lot of additional context. But I don't think that fundamental training principle is going to be completely different for Josh than it is for me. And that, again, sounds trivial, but I don't think it is the more you really sit and think about it. And so that's just the first thing, is that kind of underlines all of this. So it's not that for Josh, actually less volume is actually going to be better for him for muscle growth than it is for me. Now, I might give you a lower volume training program than I might other clients, but that's going to be for different reasons than me trying to find the magic combination of variables that optimize your progress for reasons that I can't totally articulate. It's for other reasons that we're going to get into here in a second. Does that kind of make sense? Anything to add there?
No, I think that's perfect. And that's another topic, but that is a massive shift.
Yeah.
I think not only in the evidence-based community, but I've kind of noticed it. You just got to do what works for you, bro. Mm-hmm. Is a common phrase, but hopefully our show can kind of help you actually conceptualize what that means and when that could also lead you astray and when it wouldn't apply. So I think that's spot on.
Cool. Okay, so with that kind of assumption understood, I think there's kind of 5 main pillars of what is going to influence these, theoretical twins programming. And the first one is probably the most obvious, but I think this is one that I've grown more appreciative over time in terms of how seriously I take it, is just someone's goals and their priorities. I think at face value, someone's goal can seem superficial. I'm a powerlifter. I'm somebody who's interested in hypertrophy. But at the end of the day, like, you can really shape a training program in a more customized way the better that you understand someone's priorities. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes from a dialogue that can be a lot deeper than people maybe do for the most part. At least I knew I did for a long time. So just as an example, it's like it was almost sacrilegious coming up in the kind of iron game for us to like not want to train legs, for example, just things like that. And that it's a valid goal and it's a valid priority for somebody that genuinely could have massive implications on the rest of the training program if you make that a very clear and understood priority for somebody, because that's going to free up training time. That's going to free up potential other overlapping parts of your organization of the training week that you maybe thought was something as just kind of your base principle that you can completely change for this individual because you more clearly articulated what matters to them and what doesn't. Mm-hmm. So just as a basic example, is we often talk about the principles to maximize hypertrophy. But it's also helpful to understand what's going to allow them to make some progress. But if it's a muscle group that they genuinely just don't care about, then you can architect the training program in an entirely different way than you maybe would if you're trying to make sure all the boxes are checked. Yeah. And so I think really, really deeply understanding someone's goals, priorities, and what is actually important to them is like an absolutely foundational part of the process, because that's going to set the initial constraints to which everything else can kind of filter through.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with that more. I think the goal of a coach is not to say where the ship is headed. Instead, it is to provide the map or some of the hurdles or some of the implications of where the lifter chooses for the ship to head. Mm-hmm. And then once that's been made clear and maybe revisited at times, you need to confirm that the ship is moving in the right direction at an appropriate pace. And when you do veer off track for one reason or another, intentional or unintentional, that it's not going too far off track. Yep. That's the way that I think about it, because in the case of not wanting to train legs, like, sure, you could joke about it being like a free pass to skip leg day, but that also is the reality for some people, is like they just don't care about how big their legs are. Yeah. So the approach that I would take is I would have a conversation about that and say, hey, like, yeah, we definitely are not going to like have you do 3 leg days a week, super high volume. At the same time, there might be some like low effort ways to just make sure that like from a health and longevity perspective and, just kind of getting ahead of the curve in terms of the inevitable sarcopenia that might happen in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we should still do this. Exactly. But here's how we can make it nice and easy. What do you think? Yep. Right? And they still might say, I don't want to do that. That's not really something I care about. That's not for you to decide. Yep. So I think that is easy to like overlook and just say, oh, their goals are hypertrophy. Cool. Here's hypertrophy program. Yeah. There's a lot more to it.
100%.
So I think that example is a good one.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that, like you said, it's just something that is taken as a much simpler variable than I think it really is. And I think, again, the reason it's so important is because it sets the constraints for literally the entire rest of the training program. Just as a basic example, let's say you can only train 4 days a week and you don't want to train legs, but you do really want to prioritize your arms. That fundamentally changes probably the total amount of training that you can fit in for your arms if you have a capped length of your session. And given we just made the assumption that, generally speaking, more volume is better for hypertrophy, that kind of unlocks a training prescription that with those additional constraints of I have to squat, I have to do RDLs, I got to fit these things in as well. Now we don't have to leverage those myo reps as much for the arm work that we just talked about. Like there's other things that kind of those pillars influence all kind of one another if you don't set that constraint with enough nuance initially. So that's the first thing. The second thing, this is probably more so geared towards strength, but I do think this does, like, the more that I've grown to appreciate hypertrophy, I do think it has a good amount of carryover there as well in certain regards. And it's honestly just the leverages. So like the biometrics, if you will, of an individual. I think that it was, very easy to say a squat is a squat is a squat, or a bench is a bench is a bench, kind of coming up, particularly with like me coming more so from the strength side of things and kind of just assuming that leverages and segment lengths and torso lengths and femur lengths and your humerus length, all these kind of factors that are just kind of going to come all out in the wash, and it doesn't matter that much. I honestly think that is like such a fundamental aspect of providing the stimulus in the areas that you want that cannot go overlooked. So I think that is just something that is really, really important. It becomes more important as you get more advanced, because I think it's going to show up in quote unquote holes in your development, either from a strength perspective or maybe potentially your physique. But it's something that I think needs to be taken seriously. And that's another aspect of the customization game. To give an example, let's say you have somebody with really, really long femurs, and you're wanting to bring up their quads. That difference in leverage is probably going to fundamentally change the training intervention. Here's an example. Let's say you have a long femur and short femur individual, and they both really like squats, but they're trying to bring up their quads. For the shorter femur individual, that may be a totally suitable option for him to, reach failure of his quads during that exercise. And that's not something you need to violate his preference in order to reach his goal of maximum progress. But for somebody with really, really long femurs, there's a good chance that that's probably not the best exercise to develop their lower body, particularly their quads. And so that's where, again, these kind of big things change. And the reason, again, that's so, so important, it's not just because of exercise selection. It's because of this entire game of balancing the entire training stress across the week. If I'm using a less specific tool for the job to train his quads necessarily, then I might have to increase the number of sets that I'm doing to achieve the stimulus, to make the needle budge on the area that I'm looking to develop, to have these downstream effects that I'm looking for. So it fundamentally changes the calculus of the entire process if you're using a spoon to chip at a rock rather than a pickaxe. And that's just fundamentally a different math problem. And so I think understanding somebody's leverages and the pros and cons that come with that in terms of the way that it interfaces with the exercises is absolutely key, both for strength and for hypertrophy. Anything to add there? No?
I think a good someone that's just seen a lot of reps can do this pretty intuitively. Like they can look at someone barbell benching and just pretty quickly recognize whether or not it's a good pec stimulus for them. That could be subjective feedback. That could be based on forearm length. It could be based on like the angle of their sternum, whether it's flat or kind of creates like a natural incline for them. Sometimes it just means you have to be a little bit more in the weeds helping them out, because the movement might end up being good for them. Like I have long femurs. I can get a high bar squat to be a pretty dang good quad stimulus. I just have to make sure that certain things are in a good spot. I might elevate my heels using multiple things. Like I might wear heeled shoes and even a slight elevation beyond that. So it just and stance width tends to matter a lot more, whereas someone that's, it tends to be shorter folks just can sink into it really easily. So sometimes it is outright exercise selection changes. Other times it's just okay, we need to intervene here because the starting point is not sufficient for where we want them to go.
Yeah, exactly. And I would call those modifications, essentially, to me, that's different exercises.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're spot on. And I think that can, even go one step further in terms of kind of also considering injury history for this reason. Even if you have a fixed structure, but you have, let's say, an injury history that prohibits a certain joint from moving as expected, one that comes to mind for me is I have like tons of ankle sprains in high school. And my ankles just don't bend like you would expect. And that influences the way I do a lot of exercises in terms of the stance width I need to use and how much dorsiflexion I can reach. And again, that's just going to have fundamental downstream consequences on the entire way that the training program looks because of it. And that can obviously apply to different joints, areas, muscles, et cetera, for the injury history. So that's number 2. Number 3 would be training history. And so this will be your essentially what training history equates to is your relative strengths and weaknesses, both from a strength or force production perspective, but also, again, from your physique. The way that you've trained in the past is going to influence the way that your current goal needs to be reached. So just as an example, super, super basic example, let's say I have a cyclist, somebody who is super, super well experienced on the bike, their quads are massive, and they come to me for improving their squat as a powerlifter. The way that I intervene there is going to be substantially different than somebody who maybe comes from a physique background that is entirely dedicated on their glute development, let's say. That fundamental difference in training history, even though, let's say, they've been lifting for a similar amount of time, all those other factors are the same except maybe their training history, that's going to have meaningful different training prescriptions that are required to reach even maybe the same goal, in this case, squat 1RM. So I think understanding the training history and ultimately what that has led to and how that ties in with their current goal is also really, really important. And so the reason I kind of put those two together, again, coming back to strength, is the combination of leverages and your training history basically creates what I'm going to call your strength limiter. And your strength limiter is essentially the weakest link in the chain. You've probably heard tons of people talk about that in the context of strength. When you're reaching limit loads or your maximal force production in some sort of task, what's the thing that gives out first? Typically, we think about this on a muscular level because that is typically one of the most modifiable factors we can make for strength in the long run. So that's kind of the thing we tend to focus on. But of course, there can be second and third order limiters that may change your ability to train that thing. So let's just say, again, using the same example, we're training for the squat, and let's say somebody's quads tend to be kind of the weakest link there that's giving out for their ability to complete a 1RM. But they have a really, really tough time increasing the training volume because of their conditioning, let's say. Theoretically, that's another limiter you have to consider when trying to address the real thing that's holding them back from their strength. So that kind of entire picture of their leverages and their training history are going to create what I just kind of call this picture of your limiters. And you could apply this to physique development as well, although it's not as specific, that create a really specific target for you to address with the training intervention. And that's kind of your expected target that's actually going to lead to progress in the short term. If we improve the rate limiter, that should result in an actual moving of the needle of your goal. And this can kind of be iterated upon every time you're kind of designing a training program. The next one would be external factors. And this is something I think, again, with kind of a slightly reformed position on what reasons we're doing individualization for, I think I have completely reformed how much I think this matters. I used to think that, hey, make sure you're getting your sleep. Hey, make sure you're getting your protein in. Hey, make sure you're managing your stress. I think this is close to the most important variable for long-term progress, is making sure your external factors are as optimized as humanly possible. Now, it goes without saying that certain things are what I call pseudo-modifiable. Sleep. Let's say I have 2 or 3 newborns all at the same time. To some degree, I'm not going to be able to sleep.
All at the same time?
Let's say you got triplets.
Are they triplets, or are those like coming from different sources?
What's that?
Like, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could have multiple newborns.
Yeah.
all
I see what you mean. Yeah. Maybe it's a compound of a different lifestyle. Maybe it's triplets. Who knows? I'm not to judge on the different preferences.
I don't even
lifestyles.
think it needs to be multiple, man. I think it's just one newborn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an uncle now.
Oh, there you
and
go. You're also a dog dad.
Yeah, I mean, even that sometimes is like, I mean, it's a responsibility.
Say that to somebody with a newborn. It's always my favorite thing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's always
like
the classic.
Nothing. So I know that's a nothing burger compared to someone with a with a newborn. But yeah, long story short, people very close to me having children, I can't fully relate, but I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a disruptor for sure. So yeah, if you have 2 or 3 newborns. With one or multiple baby mamas, man, you got a lot to deal with. But yeah, how would that affect potentially your sleep?
Yeah, exactly. It's to some degree you can modify your sleep, you can improve your sleep hygiene, you can try to improve your sleep practices to try to really make that as best as you can within your current lifestyle. But to some degree, there's certain factors that are going to get in your way, and I think the biggest change I've thought about this variable is that I think to some degree the reality is if you cannot improve those external factors, that caps the return on investment you can have from training to some degree. That degree is hard to know. It's hard to study. I don't know if I can totally.
I mean, an easy thought experiment is like if you are truly time constrained, there's only so much training you can do. Therefore, only so much progress you can make. I do think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of people have gotten very far along even with these constraints. We mentioned Brian Whitaker at the very start of the show. Family man, ambitious career, got to the highest level in natural bodybuilding. So yeah, that's just, it's controlling what it's like. I've heard it framed as kind of be a little bit neurotic about what you can control, but then fully accepting, which I think can be very easy for someone that is neurotic, fully accepting of what you can't control and not viewing that as a reason to reduce your effort elsewhere for the things you can control. Because even if you can, for whatever reason in this season of life, only sleep a certain amount, not have consistent training times, whatever, or even miss sessions, that's not a reason to train with less intent when you are training. And that's like an element of training skill, in my view, is controlling what you can control as often as it is repeated. Yeah,
I don't try to view them as like, so like you could think of sleep as like an absolute scale. So like 0 to 100%, let's just say 100% is 10 hours. That's a perfect sleep. I don't think people should look at it on that scale. Like, where am I at relative to like a professional athlete? Let's say
I'm sleeping 7 hours. I'm at 70%.
But I don't think you should think about it like that. I think you think about it more so in a relative sense of like, hey, external variables matter, and to the best of my ability, let's try to improve them as much as I can. But more so from the coaching side of things, the reality is if somebody is only able to sleep 5 to 6 hours a night, that alone in isolation doesn't deterministically, tell you what their program is going to be by any means. Like you said, it's not a death sentence by any means, but the probability is they're going to probably have a lower volume training intervention that's sustainable for them and allows them to make progress, because the reality is their external environment is just capped in a certain way.
Or at the very least, a flexible program.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, it's not a black and white, if their sleep is this, then the training program looks like this by any means. All I'm saying is that the external variables, being aware of those is going to probabilistically push you in the right direction of what a successful or optimal training intervention is going to look like for an individual. If you know they have a pretty erratic sleep schedule, they work a manual labor job, they have a pretty high stress lifestyle with a couple newborns, the reality is you're probably
that's hilarious to me. The couple newborns is so funny.
I mean, it's just an extreme example to kind of make the point, but the reality is you're pushing yourself in a direction of the most sustainable and quote-unquote optimal training intervention for that person in that season of life is going to be probably on the lower stress end of things. And that's not because they wouldn't benefit from higher stresses necessarily, but in that time, that's physically not capable of capitalizing on. So it's essentially suboptimal because they can't actually benefit from that training intervention given all of the factors in their life. And that's really the point I'm trying to make, is that when you take into account the various aspects of recovery and their external environment, along with their availability to train as far as time-wise, that's going to probabilistically kind of push you on around the chessboard to a spot of that is going to probably lead to a better overall starting design of the training program for that individual, and probably lead you to something that's going to be more successful on average. Mm-hmm. And so understanding those external factors, instead of just saying sleep check, recovery check, stress check, and kind of being aware of those maybe more on like a continuous basis, I think is a helpful piece of information that I used to think was maybe less important, and now I think is quite important, to the extent that I'm sometimes wanting to make changes because preemptive or expected changes of those variables might get in the way of what we have been doing and things like that. So I think, again, it's not a deterministic aspect of if you know your sleep, your stress score, and your availability to train, I can pop out your training program. It's not like that, but it's probabilistically pushing you in the right direction of each one of the core principles. That would probably be a little bit more realistic in that individual case, and probably more successful and sustainable over the long run, over the calendar year. And then finally is just the personality of the individual. And I think that's essentially just short for, as a coach or as someone writing the training program, even if it's yourself, you have a desired execution of what's on paper, right? But sometimes, we're all human, and we all have aspects of training that we enjoy that may not be totally related to the quote-unquote optimal aspects of progress on paper. That influences how you're going to best milk out what's ever on paper. And so I think being aware of those aspects of personality is going to make sure the effort bar or the actual intent in each training session is maximized, which is an assumption anytime you write anything on a piece of paper. Anytime you write a training program down, the assumption is this is going to be executed perfectly and with perfect intent. But if that's not actually the case because of the individual's personality or the way that they actually like to interact with the training process, that's no longer a safe assumption, and we should probably make some changes to make sure that that's the case, and then we can go back to kind of making the theoretical stimulus optimizing game that happens with the rest of the program. But I think that's another thing that I've grown really, really not fond of, but I've
just valued it.
Yeah, I've valued more because I think, again, I try to think about variables not in the 8-week study length time frame. I try to think about what's going to make the biggest difference over the calendar year, and taking somebody's effort from 80 to 100% because they're really engaged with the training process, and it's set up and made a few compromises in ways that we don't think are going to have massive detriments to progress, or maybe have no detriments to progress, but are slightly more in line with their preferences and their personality. I think that can have massive positive downstream effects. Little things you may think of are somebody really, really likes top sets, and maybe sometimes you think it's a good idea to take those out, but leaving those in keeps them engaged with the training process. Maybe that's a benefit for them. Other things could be the way that the protocols are designed, the rep ranges you pick, certain exercises, etc. The list goes on. But making some theoretical compromises based on those grounds, I think, can be a net positive in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I'll give an example. Mm-hmm. I have a client who's had his first kid, and his daughter turns 1 pretty soon. So over the last year, the approach to training has had to change a bit. Specifically, there's a lot more flexibility. In his case, instead of 4 sessions a week, it is basically 2 required sessions. The other 2 sessions can be skipped outright, and things are kind of set up so that the program flows smoothly, even on his worst week, if you will, while still having 2 required sessions such that those are priority enough to get some training in and kind of move in the right direction a little bit each week. Another thing is just kind of shifting the goalposts in terms of like what we're getting out of training or what he's getting out of training, and just how to psychologically approach it. Because I think that's important, and luckily we were able to discuss those things ahead of time, which I think was, in hindsight, was a really good thing. And you mentioned like personality and how someone like interfaces or interacts with the program, or even just like conceptualizes a program. I think is really helpful. I find that some people, we work with folks interested in strength, hypertrophy, or both. And when I say hypertrophy, I should probably just say physique in general, so some muscle gain and or fat loss. There's obviously like a lot of overlap there. So I find that some people, when maybe we are a little bit less focused on top end strength for a period of time, such as this client that I'm talking about, depending on like their flavor of training and kind of like how they got into training and what resonates with them, can kind of inform the style of training I provide in kind of a minimum effective dose program. So I have some people that they would love a singlet 5 just as a way to kind of get up and touch something, even if they're really time constrained and we're not too worried about, maximizing top end strength in the immediate term. I have other people that would absolutely hate that and would rather take a different road to Rome to achieve the goal of a minimum effective dose for strength and or hypertrophy. So ultimately, like sometimes explicit questions can help with this. Other times it is just implicit things you pick up. So I like to ask two things on the front end when working with someone. The first is, what are you looking for out of a coach? And almost always they're like kind of surprised to hear that. Like, oh, why would you actually think to ask that? That's a good question. And it forces them to reflect. That information is helpful because like you can get insights right away. Some people, it's less about the programming. They kind of just want someone to like celebrate wins with and to pick them up when they're down. Other people, it's all about the programming, right? And that can kind of slightly alter what things you emphasize with them. The second question that's more relevant here is like, what gets you excited to train? I think that can be very insightful as well. We were talking about this at the very beginning of the show. We, maybe it varies at times, but tend to be pretty excited about performance, beating what you did last week, hitting a new PR, chasing a new 5-rep max, 10-rep max, or 1-rep max. Even if training for hypertrophy, those are things that excite us. Some people are like that, some people are not, and that can give you good intuition, or that can be quite informative in terms of how to, ultimately achieve the same flavor of stimulus, but get a different flavor of programming. So we were on, me, you, and our colleague Jake were on Steve Hall's podcast recently, and Steve really likes to use the phrase, there are multiple roads to Rome. I think this is a perfect example of that. It's like what road to Rome is going to resonate with them the best and keep them engaged with the program and keep that excitement to train there. And I think, again, a combination of explicit questions and implicitly picking up on things as you go can go really, really long way over time.
100%.
Cool. All right. Next one is a little bit more chill.
Yeah, right.
So, Zach, you want to tee up for Colin our discussion on different set endpoints?
Absolutely. So I think as we've kind of grown in the understanding of autoregulation, I think it was kind of a natural evolution of it, right? So you started with some of the more subjective scales, then we started trying to objectively anchor those to something in resistance training, and obviously shout out Mike T, Dr. Zordos, kind of bringing the repetitions in reserve oriented scale into play. That kind of gives us an objective anchor, proximity to failure. But I think one thing that we've grown to appreciate more so now is that an implicit assumption anytime you use one of these scales is the definition that's very, very clear of the task. So when I say repetitions in reserve, it's repetitions in reserve from what? What am I describing? What is the definition of the task? And ultimately, what leads to my inability to complete that task, or what constraints define that? And I think the more that we've been exposed to, whether it's the linked and partial stuff, partials at their failure, injury cases, or even sometimes powerlifters kind of describe things more subjectively when they talk about their effort. All of these are kind of different cases of describing different ways to describe set endpoints. And I think we were in particular talking about some of your applications of quote unquote partials in reserve recently that I'd love to hear you talk more about.
Yeah. So Zach will play a video for you here that honestly I had no intentions of this, us playing this on the podcast, but we were talking about it as a potential segment. So I just kind of snagged it and we're going to play it here. So, Yeah, ultimately, when you're doing sets and reps in the gym, it's very common to have some sort of like set difficulty or exertion rating alongside that. The most common is RPE, rating of perceived exertion, as you noted, or reps in reserve. My general approach before you play this sack is just to kind of discuss what our general take on RPE versus RIR. My typical approach and suggestion for folks is to think of RPE simply as the inverse of reps in reserve. So in other words, I actually almost exclusively use reps in reserve. However, there's a wrinkle to reps in reserve that we'll discuss, where we like to use the term partials in reserve. And then there are times where we stray from that strict definition of RIR-based RPE. So in other words, we do kind of use some other flavors of RPE in specific scenarios. Do you use a similar approach?
Yeah, I think so. It's just defining the task in different ways, yeah.
Cool. So typically, if you're thinking of RPE strictly in terms of the inverse of RIR, a 10 out of 10 would mean you have no reps in the tank. Either you complete a rep and you have no chance of another, or you actually fail the rep. A 9 RPE would be 1 rep in the tank. 8 RPE would be 2 reps in the tank, etc. However, it's important to define what a rep is. Yeah. And that's where partials in reserve comes in. So in all of the power lifts, which is where a lot of this stuff originated, the hardest part of the movement is at the bottom. It's at the start of the movement. So if you can't get another rep on bench press, it might come off your chest, and there are some people that fail at lockout, but generally speaking, the hardest part of the movement is at the bottom. For squat, same idea. You might be able to get a little bit of the way up, even halfway up at times, but you're not going to fail at the top, right? Mm-hmm. If you get through that sticking point, you're going to lock it out. Same idea with deadlift. Deadlift's a little bit more common to fail at lockout, but nonetheless, generally speaking, if you can only get a partial range of motion on squat, bench, or deadlift, you're not going to get another rep. Same idea with like a dumbbell bench press. Again, the hardest part is at the bottom. You're not going to get another rep. So reps in reserve, or RPE, just makes a lot of sense for those movements, because a rep is a rep. If you can't start the rep, you're not going to complete the rep. However, there are some movements where it's different. So the example we'll show here in a second is a chest fly, especially a machine chest fly. If you have it set up a certain way with cables, you can kind of change this and manipulate it. But for a machine chest fly, this is the case. For a leg extension, this is the case. For a lot of tricep movements, this is the case. A lot of lateral delt exercises, this is the case. A lot of back exercises, this is the case. Hamstring curls as well, where the hardest part of the movement is not the start of the movement, it's the end of the movement. So if you can't complete another rep at the very end of a chest fly where you're finishing the rep, or the very top of a leg extension, or the very top of a lateral raise, you do not have any full reps in reserve, but you absolutely still have partials in reserve. So for a lot of those movements, because of the importance of proximity to failure that we see just generally in the research, and also some direct research directly on these sets where you go past that full range of motion failure and you continue to get partial reps after that point, we instead will tell our lifters to think of it as partials in reserve. In the training session I did right before this, I did a couple of back movements. I did machine rows and I did lat pull downs. On machine rows, once I could no longer get the full range of motion, I just squeezed out as much range of motion as I could on subsequent partials. For some exercises, you can get like 5, 6, 7 partials. It also depends on the rep range, of course, but generally speaking, 5, 6, 7 partials. Other times it's only 1 or 2. But I do think there is good reason to just anchor your RPE based on your inability to get any range of motion at all. And I think this can add a lot more stimulus, a lot more hypertrophy to these exercises where the hardest part is at the end of the range of motion, not the start. So, Zach, unless you have anything to add, we can go ahead and watch this amazing set, beautiful cinematography here, I can't remember how long this is, so you'll have to bear with us. So you can see I'm doing these chest flies, and I'm getting absolute full range of motion. I'm getting nice deep stretch as much as is comfortable, and I'm fully locking it out here. I'm fully completing the rep, bringing my my knuckles to the point where they're touching or close to it. And then eventually, if I fail, it'll be the fact that I can't finish the rep. So I don't know exactly when it's going to occur, but there's going to be a point where I can't bring my knuckles all the way together. And you could just stop the set there. So there I think I didn't get it right. So I get another one, and then I get like 10%. So in that case, I think I got 3 partials. And that's one where I can't get many partials at all. On leg extensions, I can sometimes get like 8, 9, something like that. So hopefully seeing that visual is helpful because it's something that we've talked about on the show, but we've never actually provided a visual. And I'm often talking through this for my clients, and having a nice reference for their podcast listeners is helpful as well. So anything to add there?
No, yeah, I think that's basically how I think about it too, is just thinking about for each exercise. Yeah, I mean, I guess what you said is kind of really what applies in all cases, is anchoring the RIR to not being able to move the load at all, really. And that's what happens in all the exercises that RIR was kind of traditionally used with, is like you could maybe move the bench a little bit off your chest, like you said, but for the most part, you're not able to complete even a half rep when you kind of fail. And so kind of standardizing that across movements and across resistance profiles, probably more importantly, that kind of is an important consideration to make. And I think this applies both in kind of the extended set kind of approach to the partials, but it also could apply to lengthened partials themselves if you want to kind of start the set using some sort of modified execution. That also works. But in reality, you could apply the framework to any task you want. It's just about very clearly defining the task and then ultimately approaching the in reserve part relative to that task. And just for hypertrophy, it makes sense to kind of anchor that more so to the point in which something you can't really move it at all in a lot of cases. I think there are other applications that do make a lot of sense. I don't know if you want to go into those before you talk about anything, but
no, I think we can go over those briefly. Are you specifically talking about like other flavors of the RP chart?
Yeah, just like essentially other tasks that are useful. I think the number one that's like useful for me that I use quite frequently and kind of allows a seamless approach to programming when you're inevitably dealing with the aches and pains that come along with training. It's just shifting the task from that point where you can't move the load anymore at all to I can't move it anymore without discomfort that exceeds my tolerance. I think it's called the rating of perceived tolerance scale. I think barbell rehab is where I kind of got it from.
If you look up rating of perceived tolerance, barbell rehab.
Yeah, I really, really like that as kind of a framework I'm often trying to like talk to my clients about, is just trying to realize that these kind of things always happen. You're never really off program, or you're never really out of the loop with training. These are just all skills that you can kind of build all of the time, and you can kind of just come in and out with these things, and they're all kind of realities that we'll struggle with at one point in time. So kind of building that training skill set now and just realizing that having to leverage one of these tools isn't a big deal, and we don't have to like abandon the training altogether, I think is a good mindset and skill set to have. So this is where something like that has been super, super useful to me. If somebody's knee starts to bother them or something like that for multiple weeks in a row, even with minor adjustments, you can flip it on to like RPT instead of RIR, and that really seems to help in a lot of cases to kind of change the task slightly to get the momentum that you're looking for as far as tolerance of an injury or something like that goes.
Yeah. So to summarize, our general approach to RPE ratings that we ask of is to think of it strictly in terms of reps in reserve. However, you have to define what a rep is. Is it a full rep or a partial rep? And then secondly is saying, okay, there are times where you should stray from that strictly RIR reps in reserve based RP scale. Specifically, the most common case is when an ache or a pain pops up. Basically, instead of an RPE of 7, you use a rating of perceived tolerance of 7, and you basically just say, hey, I think the way the scale is defined is the number of reps away you are from it no longer being tolerable,
Exactly.
which is sometimes hard to judge exactly,
That's
but
kind of the point.
it's kind of the point.
Yep.
And it, like you said, the biggest thing is it just allows people to continue to train within what they can do, right? That's the point, right? And I like to break situations where you're managing an ache or a pain up into like two categories. The first is reactive, and the second is proactive. So I view RPT as a reactive method for the athlete to use their training skill within the session to basically take what's there within the parameters that you've agreed upon. The second is proactive, right? If someone is dealing with an issue, depending on the severity, you may have to make proactive changes, right? You might not be pushing their volume as high as before. You might train less frequently. You might swap exercise selection, but that is a proactive change from a high level, whereas you also want to give the athlete the tools to make reactive changes within the session when they're executing within certain parameters, and RPT is an amazing tool to do that.
Sweet.
Cool. All right, very last segment for us here is, this is an evidence-based podcast. when it's convenient.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But when interpreting evidence, there's more that goes into it than just taking a study finding and just assuming that that is correct. There's a lot of fog of war in terms of interpreting studies and also applying the concepts we get from studies. And there are some basic ones that you could probably find on the internet if you do a search for it, such as just understanding what statistical versus clinical significance is like a common one, which I see you kind of cringing a little bit inside, because that in and of itself is a little bit of a oversimplification.
Sure.
Or just thinking about the relevance of the participants used in the study, right? There's a lot of basic ones, but I think there's maybe another rung of the ladder in terms of things to consider when interpreting training studies that are often overlooked by a lot of folks, and maybe even your favorite evidence-based influencer is making one or multiple of these mistakes. So can't think of a better person to take us on this ride than you, Zach. And I'm looking at your outline for this. This could be 5 separate podcast episodes.
Right.
So
right.
Have fun attacking this one.
Cool. So like Josh said, I think one thing that has been helpful throughout the PhD process, I think we can both be firsthand and kind of talking about, is just how much you realize that you're making inappropriate conclusions from things. And just like I always talk about, just like the I should write a blog post or something, like just how data deceives us. And just like that to me was like just the biggest rabbit hole I went down throughout my PhD, is just learning all of these different ways that seemingly obvious conclusions that you can draw from data in a lot of different ways are actually way more complex and sometimes completely counterintuitive to what you would expect. And it's just made me value the times that my head has got slammed into a door that I'm trying to go in because I've been making an error and someone corrects me for it, whether it's a colleague or whether it's somebody on my committee, and through just independent reading. And so, when we, look at across the landscape of social media, you come across a lot of these same misinterpretations for better or for worse. And I don't think they're malicious by any means. I don't think people necessarily are always intentionally misinterpreting things, but I do think kind of talking through some of these can be helpful, so you can kind of be on the lookout for potentially some of these cases of misinterpretation and aid your own interpretation of training studies to hopefully come closer to the truth. So I broke these down into what I'll call 5 fallacies. That word fallacy kind of sounds a little bit pretentious. I don't necessarily mean it to come across that way, but it was kind of clickbaity, and they made for good sound bites, so I kind of went with that theming. But yeah, kind of 5 big lessons or 5 big mistakes that I often see or I personally have made when interpreting studies. So the first one, and this one has got a lot of discussion recently, but this is kind of a more umbrella way of describing it, is just what I'm going to call the false attribution fallacy. And so anytime you have a study or a group of studies, it's really, really, really tempting to go through the methods section with a fine-tooth comb and really try to find out why this study may slightly differ from the other studies in kind of the related area of research, and may attribute that to the exercises or the participants or the length of the training intervention or these numerous characteristics that you could probably drive yourself insane going through, and even sometimes really strongly convince yourself that this is why it's different.
It all makes sense.
It all makes sense. If you comb through hard enough, there's a reason. And I think that is a really, really noble pursuit, and I think it comes from a good place of really trying to be detail-oriented and understand the studies at a very, very high level, and I never think that should be sacrificed. But I think it's really important to realize...
It's necessary but not sufficient.
Exactly. I think it's really important to realize that you could find these different factors, and a perfectly valid and likely and expected explanation is just what I'm going to call the variance demon that's just kind of lurking in the background. So I think the concept of variance that's gotten a lot of talk recently has been sampling variance. So sampling variance, I'll kind of go through these each quickly. Sampling variance is just the fact that, let's say we have this overarching population that's in the clouds. This is kind of an assumption that we typically make in research, that we're trying to gain information about a population, but it's not easy to obtain all the participants or all the individuals that exist in that population, so we have to take a subset. So every time we take a subset, you're going to have some variability in the subset that you gather from that population, and so necessarily there's going to be some variability every time you take that subset. If we were able to get the entire population at once, there is no variability. We know what the population is going to tell us. And so when we have small sample research, the variance that we get from each one of these samples that we have is going to be greater and greater and greater. And so even if we know what the population, their mean is, or whatever we're trying to calculate with a given study, the difference between two groups, even if we know what that is, because of the fact that we have small sample research, we're going to have a lot of variability that may lead some studies to find positive findings, some studies to have negative findings, purely because of the sampling variance and nothing to do with the underlying reality of the matter. And so that's the first thing to consider. The next one is measurement error, and that's something I think people have an intuitive sense of, is that even we have, lab grade tools, we measure the exact same quality twice that we assume to have the same true value. Like, for example, if I was to measure your quadriceps twice or 3 times in a row, it's not like your quadricep is changing its true value in the span of 30 seconds when I'm measuring it. So any differences between those measurements, I'm going to assume is some sort of user error. And so those types of errors can, in small sample research, can sometimes pool on one side of the direction. Maybe it's going to systematically upwardly bias the measurements that we're making, or downwardly bias the measurements that we're making. The point is, typically what we're assuming is that if we have enough of a sample size and we're able to estimate this measurement error well, it's going to kind of wash out. It's going to be normally distributed, and it's not something that we're going to necessarily need to worry about our ability to gain that information that we're looking for. But in smaller sample research, things can happen where greater measurement error is just going to lead to findings that we wouldn't expect. And the same thing goes for sampling variance, like we just said. More measurement error, more the effects that we observe in every individual study is just going to bounce around even more. And then finally, we have another source of variability called biological variability that can also influence the results that we get. These are just the natural fluctuations in whatever we're measuring. Those are going to naturally vary over time. And again, the point of this is all of these sources of variability are constantly lurking in the background anytime we do a study, and are magnified when we have small sample research that is usually low in power, that we often have in exercise science research. So instead of attributing the differences between studies to these exact methods differences that we see or we may think is what's leading to the difference, it very well could be, and often probably is the case, it's just the variance demon that's kind of lurking in the background that's probably the true explaining factor of the matter, and we would just be falsely attributing the differences to something else if we don't acknowledge that. So I think that's the first thing to just kind of have in the back of your mind anytime you're interpreting studies, particularly with small samples, as an exercise science. Anything on that one?
No, I think you nailed it. I'll give an example of one that has actually caught on quite a bit, and I also agree with it. I tend to think it's true, but I do think it's an example of I think it's an example potentially of false attribution fallacy, as you're calling it, is in your meta-regression on the effects of proximity to failure on muscle growth, you had a sub-analysis of different loads. So you have, I can't remember the predicted loads, but I think it was like low, 30, moderate,
30,
low, moderate, high load, something like that. Yeah. Call it 30, 50,
90, something like that. Yeah.
30,
something like that.
I can't remember the numbers, but nonetheless, basically you saw that the slope of the relationship did tend to change depending on the load. So at higher loads, the effective proximity to failure on muscle growth seemed to be less. So proximity to failure seems to be less of a consideration when training with higher loads to maximize muscle hypertrophy. However, based on the nature of those sub-analyses, there is also variance amongst the studies that independently look at that question that could be causing that to show up, because to my knowledge, there are few studies, if any.
Levicius. Good one.
Yep.
Direct.
Is there? I think that might be the only one.
It's not very many. No.
Yeah. Call it 1 to 3.
Sure.
There's 1 to 3 studies that directly look at the question of how does load mediate the effect of proximity to failure on muscle growth.
Yep.
And I think I speak for you in saying that those sub-analyses are exploratory and hypothesis generating, as opposed to conclusion generating, right?
Yep.
So you could falsely attribute the effects of load from that sub-analysis, even though, again, there's other sources from that variance demon going on there. And I struggle pointing that one out because I do think that is the case. Like, I think it just checks out from other areas of research as well, and I think it's okay to use a visual of that sub-analysis to kind of make a point, even though it's not, like, I get it. Yeah. But I do think that's an example of where in evidence-based fitness we can, like, use research when maybe we just should say what we think.
Yeah,
what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think meta-analysis is a tough one, because the meta-analysis is a tough one. It's particularly in the case of sub-analysis or moderator analysis. The point you're bringing up is that, and the question ultimately is, if there are no other factors that are quote-unquote causing the studies that have higher loads,
it's not causally designed for that.
Right. If there's no other confounding variable, essentially, that, let's say, studies with heavier loads also tend to use greater volumes or something like that, something to that effect. If there's no other, like, clouding causal variable that's systematically biased in that direction, so, like, again, the volumes really tend to be higher in the higher load conditions and the really tend to be lower in the lower load conditions, something to that effect. If it's kind of normally distributed and there's kind of, noise that kind of cancels each other out in a way, it's less of a concern. And with meta-analysis, we're trying to take all of those studies and try to detect the signal from the noise if there is one. So if there's a best case for trying to find attribution that is true to these kind of systematic differing factors, but as you say, there's kind of this unknown factor of, is there another variable that's confounding that relationship that we can glean from it?
Or so variables, plural.
Exactly. And so what you say is exactly true, is that it can be hypothesis generating, it can be quite literally better than nothing, but you have to acknowledge the fact that there also could be something that's completely biasing that relationship, and it could be incorrect. So I think those types of relationships, this is something I'm workshopping, so don't take this too literally. I think moderated analyses are helpful when they are first and foremost, are very strongly theory driven in which ones we're looking at. That's the first thing, because when you have a strong theory or strong a priori predictions about what that may be the case, I think you can have better theoretical and rationale to take that with a little bit more confidence if you do find what you would expect. That doesn't necessarily mean it's devoid of these limitations that we just discussed, not necessarily, but coming in with strong theory and predictions on what you may expect, I think gives more credence to it, because it's more biological plausibility, more theoretical plausibility. And then ultimately, if you do find the signal and you're able to verify there doesn't seem to be any massive candidates of strong confounding, I think that's not an unreasonable take to use that in practice, but it's very hard to verify that without direct evidence. Now, in this case, like I said, I think there's 1 to 3 examples of direct examinations of the question, so I don't think it's totally unreasonable, along with the fact I think it makes theoretical sense, but you're totally spot on in the sense that to some degree, that attribution should come with a massive asterisk that I didn't even do a great job communicating before I thought about this more. So, you're spot on.
Do you think it's better to, if you are making that point, do you think it's better to use moderator analysis from a meta-analysis like that, or using the one study we have on it? Like, which is stronger?
So, again, in theory, the moderator analysis is better. The problem is, without a very, very strong examination of potential confounding variables, you can't know if it's unbiased. So from that perspective, I think having the two of them together is a nice kind of double check to say, okay, what does this individual study say that directly answers the question? Great. Now, when we look at all the evidence and kind of collectively looks at this, if it generally checks with that but has just more of a precise estimate and allows us to detect those smaller differences or smaller effects, I think that's decent rationale to be like, oh, this might make sense.
It's like tracking progress for a lifter in practice. Is like you're going to use multiple vectors. If you're looking at fat loss, you might look at photos, you might look at waist circumference measurement, you might look at body weight, and then you might use performance in the gym to make sure that the body weight loss isn't all muscle mass, right?
Exactly.
So it's like any one of those in isolation isn't sufficient, but that's, I think, a helpful point for the listeners that like oftentimes the things that we think we know about research are not from any individual thing. And we also talked about this recently on Steve Hall's podcast when me, you, and Jake were on it, it's almost less about like the individual dose-response relationships between variable A and outcome B. But instead, it's almost like one level higher than that. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but I thought it was interesting. So I'll let you take it from there.
Okay, so second one, this might be my favorite one.
He's fired up.
I'm pretty fired up about this one. And this is what I call the equivalence fallacy. So you have probably heard numerous times and probably heard us say it multiple times as well. So
we just talked about it at the beginning of the show.
Yeah, we'll just hold our hands up on definitely falling prey to this. But this is something.
I did say.
Go ahead.
I did say if we had 1,000 participants that it might lean one way or the other. So I did have equivalence fallacy in mind.
Yeah, no, I actually think I specifically listened to how you said it, and it passed. It passed. Yeah, okay. I recall. So let me pull this over here just while I'm talking about this. So it's up. Okay, so equivalence fallacy is essentially a difference in how we would interpret typical null results. That's essentially the issue. So story goes something like this. You hear your favorite influencer interpreting a study. The studies with typical sample sizes that we usually see, training intervention A versus training intervention B, and the conclusion is there were no significant differences, or the estimate, if you want to have more like the estimation-based approach, the confidence interval contains 0, the credible interval contains 0, something to the fact that the results tended to be null. The corresponding inference with that, or the conclusion that is made, is that these two protocols are the same. They're equivalent. They're practically similar. And that is just not what that shows. And fundamentally is just an over-extrapolation of what that evidence says. Now, I'm not saying that couldn't be the case, but it's the amount of confidence we have in that statement should be far, far lower. So here's the way that I like to frame this. From any given study, there's going to be some sort of numeric value or numeric estimate that's going to be relevant for the primary research question you're trying to address. Typically, program A versus program B, you're going to look at the difference between those two conditions. in every study that you see, there's going to be some sort of uncertainty value that's also associated with that number. And that uncertainty value is basically directly tied to our confidence that we can have in what the results of the study show. And so a piece of interpretation that is essentially always missed on social media with these types of results, and I think massively improves your understanding of how to interpret research if you really crystallize this and get this, is that just because a uncertainty interval on a value contains 0, which means that there's no significant differences or no differences between groups, that does not mean that your estimate is very, very precise. And we know that the two groups are equivalent. In reality, what often happens is the interval is super duper wide and extends on both sides of 0, which is essentially saying that that difference is compatible with something that's really strongly in favor of protocol A or really strongly in favor of protocol B. Or what else does that mean? The study is essentially ambiguous. And I think the problem is...
You heard it here first. Yeah. Most studies are ambiguous. And also, our colleague Seth Hinson has a paper on, it's related to muscle lengths. Yeah. The details are irrelevant. I honestly think that this, like the way that we reported the results in that study with equivalence fallacy in mind, to basically saying just because there's no difference does not mean they're the same.
Yep.
That's basically what you're saying.
Yep.
There's no difference in that study, but there also wasn't enough indication or enough certainty to say that they were the same.
Yep.
So is it data that's helpful to have? Can we get some idea which way it leans? Absolutely. Can it be meta-analyzed? Absolutely. At the same time, actually properly reporting these things, there's a reason why it's not always done, because I guarantee you, if we would have framed it in such a way that they were the same, which is what is typically done,
yep.
It would have gotten more press. It would have gotten more downloads. It would have gotten more shares.
Yep.
So keep this stuff in mind, that not only are these fallacies important when you're interpreting research or you're thinking about how your favorite evidence-based influencer interprets research, but also there's going to be a selection bias towards the papers that fall prey to these fallacies in the manuscripts themselves.
Yep. Because they're attractive, exactly. Yeah, and so exactly like Josh said, ultimately the issue here is that that size of that interval is ultimately our, for better or worse terms, I'm not using entirely technically accurate terms throughout this to try to be more.
There's like 2 people in the world that will know.
Try to be conceptually
you can water
accurate.
It down.
But the size of that interval is essentially saying, where are we confident that that true value could fall? Yeah. And so if you think about it, when I'm making the statement that 2 things are equivalent with a bold, with a Sharpie marker with a period after it, that's saying that I'm really confident that the difference is really close to 0 or essentially 0. That's what you're saying with that statement. It's equivalent. It's basically 0. I know that that is the case. If you look at the intervals from pretty much any of these studies that find no significant differences, that is not the case. It by definition is extending on both sides of 0, and usually because they're really low-powered studies, pretty far in both directions, to the extent that the practically relevant effects that we would kind of roughly proxy are kind of on both sides of the 0 line, meaning we don't really know. The mean very well may lean in one direction of the 2 conditions, but that's just because you have to assign a mean somewhere, right? You quite literally have to have a best guess.
And you wonder why this guy cares so much about good meta-analysis.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so exactly, and that is exactly why meta-analysis is so helpful, because the entire point of that is to take those intervals and shrink them. It's going to increase our efficiency. It's going to improve our precision and make really confident we know what the effect is, so then we can take the next step and practically say, is this something we should care about? How should we intervene with this information, et cetera? And so with this in mind, this is like the best way to kind of visually conceptualize this topic. This is a graph that kind of shows 4 different potential outcomes for a statistical test. And so in the very first row, so you have A, B, C, D there. In row A, you can see, again, this is the mean difference. This is the difference between, let's say, protocol A and protocol B. The difference is slightly favoring group A. But the interval of that estimate is crossing 0. So that is exactly what it will read in most papers. No significant differences, no differences. These 2 protocols are the same. That is not the case. You can see that that interval is extending on the other side of 0, and this is a less egregious example, but imagine that estimate is really tightly close to 0 and the interval extends pretty much equally on both sides. You're basically saying that estimate is compatible with equivalent estimates on both sides of the 0 line.
Wouldn't a lot of studies be D?
Yeah, I think even that's definitely true. I'm trying to paint the example of where like practically relevant effects examine on both sides.
Yeah.
A better example would be D, but the interval is way wider.
Yeah.
That would be a better example. But yeah, usually they're going to lean in one direction because we have a small sample, but the interval is so wide that you're going to say, well, if the negative estimate, let's say it's negative 10 kilos for strength, and the positive estimate's like 20 kilos for strength, both of those are practically relevant. So what am I to take from that? And so ultimately, something to say something is confidently equivalent would be like more like example C. So those dashed lines on the outside there, those are what are called equivalence bounds, or essentially your threshold that is subjectively derived to say what is a practically relevant effect. If we can say our estimate is really, really confident and it's inside those bounds, then we're confidently saying two things are equivalent. Now, in that example, it's also not crossing the 0 line, so you would say something is different, but it's also practically equivalent. And that's where this can get really, really tricky when you kind of think about those two tests as somewhat independent of one another. But the point of this is, taking a step back and thinking about the kernel of truth here, or the kernel that is the most important for interpretation, is that when you see something that says no differences, or not statistically significantly different, or these two protocols are the same, you need to verify that the estimates that they're reporting are pretty darn precise to confidently say two things are equivalent. And usually the methods section is very, very robust if you're going to try to prove those things to be the case. So what did I make more complicated than it should be?
No, I think you did a good job getting into the weeds a little bit, but also just saying very straightforward the practical implication of this. Yeah. And that is just, it kind of sucks when you initially hear this, if you haven't heard it before, is that most individual studies are ambiguous. Yeah. Individual studies are more likely than no information to provide us some indication. It's also helpful to point out that some studies, you can get information from studies beyond just the comparison that they're making.
For sure.
So, for example, in that cluster set or the rest pause study we talked about at the beginning of the show, I would have to think a little bit more about this and look at the numbers a little bit closer, but you can probably have pretty high confidence that both groups grew muscle, and that is interesting in and of itself. They were trained individuals, that sort of thing. Whereas the between group differences, if we were to like dive in, get the raw data, that sort of thing, it's probably ambiguous, right? Whether you could actually make claims about equivalence or not. Yep. But that doesn't mean it's useless or not worth reading, and you should only read meta-analyses. But I think it's also freeing in a lot of ways if you are a consumer of science, whether it's the primary source or secondary sources like a show like this. I also think it's changed the way that I think about science communication. It's also changed the way that I think about how others go about science communication. If you're not aware of this equivalence fallacy, you might be upset that some science communicators don't have direct citations, like the meme of like, oh, citation needed, which I see where that comes from, especially for extreme claims. But at the same time, I think a lot of people overestimate how much research we have for almost every area. I'm not going to talk about fields outside of ours, but I'm pretty confident that's the case for our field, and it probably applies elsewhere as well. So there's just a lot of ambiguity, I think, is ultimately what it comes down to, and a lot of the claims that you can make are just not that strong, and you have to work hard to be able to get to the point where you can make those claims. And you, like, I think as a scientific community, you have to earn that. Yeah. And I think a lot of people jump to claims before they're ready, or at least don't caution them enough with this in mind. So I think this is massive. I think this can. I think continuing to say this, so more people say it on their stuff as well. It was just key.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to clarify is just what I'm not saying, and you already mentioned a few of these, but I just want to be very clear. Absolutely does not mean that the reality of the matter isn't that the two things are the same. That very well still could be the case, but it's more so an epistemic kind of situation where we don't know what the case. We don't know what the case is. It's because we don't have enough precision to know with very precise or very high confidence what the actual difference is. And that's where meta-analysis is so crucial, is because every single study is essentially throwing a dart on the dartboard, but it has a ton of variability where you're throwing it, so you don't really know somebody's true ability.
I'm gonna cut you off, sorry.
Go for it.
I think maybe your perspective is different, but my perspective has been that people in the evidence-based like health and fitness area, whether it's like niche strength and hypertrophy or just more like general health stuff, they will fall prey to this equivalence fallacy and be pretty like chill about a lot of different alternative approaches and assume that they're all going to lead to the same outcome.
Yes.
So in other words, I think there could it's tricky. There's no like right way to go about it, because on one hand, because there isn't evidence to clearly say one way or the other, if something costs a bunch of money like a supplement, or might even have risks such as a supplement, or adds additional time or increases injury risk or whatever, I do understand why you might say that like it doesn't make sense why you're doing this health protocol or this training protocol or whatever. On the other hand, I think a lot of evidence people will brush things off preemptively because the one study we have on it shows no difference. Whereas in reality, it might be ambiguous.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like it basically is just saying that like any individual study, again, typically underpowered. This is different if you have a really well-planned study, but typically underpowered. That is essentially saying that whatever answer you find is going to have very, very low precision, and therefore is not going to give you a really confident estimate of what the true reality of the situation is. And so whether that is two interventions that are indeed the same, whether that is two interventions that may have a small difference, you're going to have a really hard time detecting what reality is because of the fact that those intervals are so wide. And so, again, it just triple highlights the fact that when we have a lot of small studies in the field, some of them say no difference, some of them find differences. The best way to aggregate those to find the quote-unquote truth of the matter, or our best estimate of the truth of the matter, is when we collect those things and we're able to improve our precision, so we know really precisely here's what our best guess is, as opposed to having super, super imprecise estimates that can stretch on both sides of the practical implication of the question. So
nailed it.
Hopefully that's helpful, yeah.
Nailed it.
Cool. The next one is what I'm going to call the snapshot fallacy. And so this is one that I really like to kind of discuss in a practical context, because I think...
Shout out Buckner for this one.
Yeah, I think
like, I know he specifically mentioned that one on our podcast.
So. Oh, okay. Did he? Did he say this like language?
No, not this language,
okay,
but I know he at least used the word snapshot, like maybe snapshot in time. I remember
that definitely. What's that phenomenon called when I like thought I invented that, but I didn't? I definitely thought I came up with this, but I'm directly recalling when he said this now.
I don't know what the phrase you're talking about is, but man, sometimes I wish we had a private podcast, like 5 listeners that we can vet, where we could give some examples where like I invented this, that I think would resonate with some listeners. Anyway,
shout out Dr. Buckner. Sorry for stealing the term, but yeah, the snapshot fallacy is essentially when you are taking information that we glean from research, and you're going to try to apply that in a different time frame than what was studied. So when we have studies, typically in the range of like 6 to 16 weeks, probably 8 to 10 weeks on average, that's a snapshot in time. So you're taking something that's designed to maximize outcomes in a snapshot of time, and you're generalizing that to your entire, lifting year or your entire calendar year of training. When I just fundamentally don't think that's the same kind of application. So, and I don't even think that's necessarily the point of research. The point of research there is to derive these principles that allow us to make the progress in the snapshot of time that is investigated. And then with some assumptions, you use that information to mold it into what's going to actually be the best practical implementation of those principles along your calendar year. And so the easiest way to talk about this is the training volume conversation, right? we may look at the infamous 52 set study or some of the other higher volume training studies. Yeah. And, that whole conversation. So let's take one of these really high volume studies. You've probably heard that the concept of it's more indicative of being beneficial for specialization cycles, short periods of volume cycling. All of these are kind of getting at the same idea that, okay, this study is showing that, periods of really high volume training or dedicated training for a specific muscle group may have some advantages as far as muscle hypertrophy goes. And so we take that concept and then we're going to apply that into a different time frame. So again, it's outside of the snapshot now. And so I'm not going to run with the exact parameters from that study and apply it on a calendar year. The reality is anyone going to be able to sustain training with 30, 40, 50 sets per muscle group close to failure with good execution for an entire calendar year? No, it's not. I think any coach would tell you that. That's probably not a sustainable strategy. But with that in mind, we understand the principle that pretty high volumes can be benefited from. And obviously, if we take your work, there doesn't seem to be a massive insidious downside of the inverted U that's going to kind of sneak up on us. So we take that principle and then we're asking ourselves, okay, they tried to maximize the training stimulus in this 8-week window. How can I apply that principle to maximize the stimulus across the calendar year? And that's going to result in a different practical prescription, but it's the same exact concept. You're applying the same principle, but because the snapshot is different or the period of time that you're applying the principle is different, that's going to fundamentally change the actual prescription that ends up on the paper while applying the exact same information. And I think that kind of manifests for literally every single training variable in the sense that, if anyone comments on the exact study protocol that why would you do this? Or you should do this instead. Like that's not the point of research. We're trying to distill principles and distill concepts that there's going to obviously be some assumptions or marginal leaps in logic to apply this in the actual real world, assuming generalizability in a few places, et cetera. But that's okay. Like that's totally fine. And to me, that's the most, that is the most intelligent way to apply these results to your actual training, not deriving the exact X's and O's from the training studies, but instead the principles and spirit, and then optimizing those in a more practical lens when you're removing yourself out of the 8 to 10 week snapshot of a training study and more so thinking about those in the context of a calendar year. And so often this is going to be probably slightly more conservative training prescriptions in certain areas because you have to sustain this for a long time and you're trying to optimize the amount of stimulus under the curve over the entire year rather than just any one 8-week period. Mm-hmm. And so that fundamentally changes the calculus of how you would design a program because you're trying to optimize the stimulus under a different time frame or different snapshot of time. And that just changes how I would actually go about the programming process if someone says I need to be as big as I can in 8 weeks versus as big as I can over the next 10 years.
Yeah. There are times where, so when you say snapshot fallacy, do you think... in a way, I kind of think it goes both ways in the sense that, there are conceivably some things that do change based on the time course of the intervention or the time course of the protocol. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're kind of saying that, the snapshot fallacy... So I guess would the snapshot fallacy come at it from the angle of, hey, don't over-extrapolate from short-term studies? Or is it coming at it from, hey, that's kind of the point, is to look at this in a vacuum over a shorter period of time?
I just think it's an additional filter. Basically,
just not considering it.
Exactly. Yeah. You're taking a principle from the study, whether that's going to result in more aggressive or less aggressive or slightly altered in some way, actual training prescription on the long run. But there's a filter that needs to be passed through.
Baked into that is that it could go either way.
Exactly.
In the sense that, in practice... yeah, this was a small effect, but it was 8 weeks, so maybe that would add up. Mm-hmm. Or on the other hand, you could say it was a small effect, but it was 8 weeks, maybe that dissipates.
Yeah. Okay. So these two are a little bit less dense, so I'll try to kind of get through them a little bit quicker. But the first one is just the measurement fallacy. So I think it's just people don't have as much of an appreciation for the implicit assumptions that we have with any measurement. So I think this is really well appreciated in fields of psychology and other fields where you have to have a really strong theory on like what you're trying to operationalize, how to measure that, the assumptions thereof. Like that's just like that's a very strong part of those fields where you have to do a really good job on defining your measurements and the limitations of them. Whereas in our field, it is sometimes, I think people potentially oversimplify the assumptions that we are making with the research tools that we have. And so the easiest example is just like when we take an ultrasound scan, and this is obviously very, very popular to talk about recently, is that when I measure someone's quad size, the assumption is that is a true representation of their quote unquote muscle size, that this is this theoretical concept that we want to know more about because that's just what we're interested in from a research perspective. But as we know, and as the conversation is currently going on is there's other factors that could potentially bias those measurement tools. You know, edema in this case, but even less insidious things like the probe location, the repeatability of the methods, the finding the bony landmarks, like all these little things that kind of go into the entire measurement process. Those all obviously contribute to measurement error and things that I think people are familiar with. But sometimes it's a higher level concern of making sure that those measurements actually map onto the qualities that we're interested in. And so one of the examples you kind of talked about when we were kind of prepping for this is just the interchangeability of like certain metrics and how those may or may not have the same underlying assumptions or even quantify the same underlying constructs, like lean body mass from a DEXA scan versus an ultrasound. You know, you hear direct versus indirect measurements of muscle size. Those have different assumptions and probably quantify different things if you think about what goes into lean mass than an ultrasound scan. And
not to mention all DEXAs are, or not all DEXAs are different, but there are different manufacturers of different DEXAs. Even if they're using the same underlying technology, they might have different softwares. Yep. There are various correction factors you can put on the DEXAs based on certain variables as well. I'm sure that an equivalent exists for ultrasound in terms of
frequencies.
The frequencies, and not to mention the inherent subjectiveness of identifying the landmarks on the ultrasound image itself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot there. We are due for our shout out of Cody Hahn's paper, Size Matters, but so does the measurement.
There it is. That's the annual shout out.
The annual shout out. I love that paper so much. He has a great table in there that just shows an example of like it was more than 3 measures of muscle hypertrophy in the same cohort just being like not in alignment at all. And I just think that's just should humble you quite a bit in terms of our understanding of what we're actually measuring. So yeah, this one's key. Yeah,
so I think it comes back to the theme of just having an additional layer of caution. I think one final example I'll leave this one with, just as a pretty big like, oh man, that's a big thing I didn't realize. Example for me when it comes to measurement is just fully grasping the fact that when you take a muscle biopsy, which I thought what used to think is like this is just the pinnacle of exercise science. You're getting the actual tissue. This is real science, like the actual pinnacle. And I'm not poo-pooing this at all. Like I think it's
great.
It's great. It's obviously very important. But
they all suck.
Yeah, but the thing I realized one day, which took me much longer than it should have to fully grasp this, is like you fundamentally cannot measure the same tissue twice.
Where'd the tissue go, Zach?
You removed it. So
it's in the freezer, brother.
So to like. Yeah, just like fully grasping that is like quite literally impossible to measure the same tissue twice because you removed it. Like that's a pretty like fundamental part of measurement is you're trying to measure the same thing, over time to see if it changed, right? And I have never performed a muscle biopsy, to be clear. Yeah. So I, definitely need to have some caution with what I just said there. But to me, that seems like a pretty basic thing that you're like, oh yeah.
I remember in like 2019 or 2020 when we were discussing some fiber type research. And trying to like make sense of it and just trying to think through some of the limitations, because at that time we were probably pretty naive to like not only the limitation you just pointed out, but some other methodological considerations and especially research done a few decades ago and how things have changed. I remember us like, I can't remember who said it, but one of us just like pointed out like, oh, it would be different tissue. It just kind of clicks with you.
No, it was definitely you. It was not me, because I remember like that like disturbed me deeply. I remember I was like, Dude, yeah, that's not what I thought. That's important.
Now, like you're obviously baking in the assumption that the tissue nearby has, and it's such a small amount of tissue.
Exactly. It's just
and even if you could get the same exact spot, like with an ultrasound, theoretically, you can get the same exact spot, but you're not getting the same exact spot. It's just a funny or interesting example.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, in no way am I invalidating the tool itself. I'm so naive to the exact procedures there that
Robinson dunks on biopsy protocols in all fields.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
You heard it here first.
Absolutely not. I have literally no knowledge of this beyond the surface level. But the thing there is just like, those are just some of the most foundational things about measurement that you kind of just need to really think through. And the point of this is just to say, like, we need to have humility with the ability to know things with confidence with respect to measurements. This is where, again, lots of data helps. It can help you sift through the signal from the noise. But the issue with measurement is if you're fundamentally not measuring the construct that you care about, there's some inferential issues there that we often need to kind of revisit every couple of years to say, hey, were we measuring what we thought we were? How can we improve this, et cetera? So that's just kind of the measurement fallacy in general. And then the last one is what I'm going to call the polarity fallacy. And this is a big one when it comes to science communication. We were talking a little bit about this earlier today. And the more I sat on it, like it's such a big thing. So for anybody that's, often heard researchers talk about a new area of research, you'll probably often hear people touch on the fact that studies are designed to have a really high probability of showing an effect. So when you're initially testing a drug or you're initially testing a new training protocol, typically speaking, you're going to try to set it up in like kind of the best faith comparison to see if there's anything going on here. This isn't to stack the books in some sort of nefarious way, but it's more so to just say, is this worth investing the resources to go down this line of research, typically speaking? And so the issue with this is, typically speaking, studies that are designed in a way of increasing the probability of showing an effect will, on average, more likely to show effects, right? And what happens on social media is these studies are going to be picked up and communicated because they provide a source of content and it's something people can discuss, right? But the issue is that typically speaking, these early studies, in order to show these, increased probability of showing an effect or a difference between the groups or what have you, they are the most polarized comparison as humanly possible. So it is training program A, where let's say you're performing one set in your left leg and you're performing 30 sets in your other leg or something like that. The example, and no other training at all. The example there is to try to really, really show that kind of best faith comparison, and that's going to increase the probability of showing a difference. But in the real world, pretty much any time that we apply one of these different resistance training principles, they are diluted by other training variables or other parts of your training program that are usually not included in the studies because you're trying to isolate the variable that you care about as much as you possibly can. The best example I thought of was the infamous Mayo hamstring study. So they compared lying hamstring curls to seated hamstring curls. It's an awesome study. It's extremely well done. They tested both the factual and kind of the counterfactual of the whole muscle length hypothesis, the front and the back side of the body, and with respect to hamstring hypertrophy. And it seems to be just a pretty safe assumption that, hey, we should do seated hamstring curls. And I think viewing that in isolation is a pretty good bet. But an obvious example where this kind of polarity of things or the training interventions aren't that different in practice is what if we're actually throwing in the multi-joint hip hinging that pretty much every single person does that's going to be applying these findings. If I also have an RDL in my program, or I also have a good morning in my program, or a hip thrust, or some sort of other hinging exercise that essentially everyone else is performing in this program, how does that change the ROI or the cost-benefit analysis between a seated and a lying hamstring curl? Mm-hmm. That kind of completely changes the calculus, and that sexy finding of the only do seated hamstring curls could be true. It could be true, but it also comes off the back of early studies that are usually designed to really strongly show an effect. And so I think this is just another case of when an area of research is young and studies are coming out. I kind of think about it as the really early studies in the area kind of set a rough ceiling of like the best case of effects. And as the comparisons between the groups gets more realistic or closer to each other, the effect is necessarily going to approach zero as the two interventions get closer and closer. So the example there is if I'm only doing seated or lying hamstring curls in the comparison, that's basically as far away from those interventions as they could possibly get from one another. But then if I go into the real world, I have squats, I have my RDLs, and the only thing I'm changing in my program is 3 sets a week of lying or seated hamstring curls. Those interventions are so similar overall that the effect necessarily is probably going to be smaller than those effects if those are the only things in the training interventions.
Yeah, it's a feature and a bug.
Exactly.
It's a feature, and I'm on record saying that I think that sometimes studies aren't polarized enough, and I tend to think that that's the way to go about things is not only polarize things but also isolate things quite a bit. So in the Mayo example of memory serves, they didn't do. Did they do any other lower body training?
I honestly can't even remember.
But they definitely didn't do any other hamstring training. Is I'm almost certain about that. That makes sense. They absolutely should have done that.
Absolutely.
And that gives us a good insight about the isolated question, because in the absence of that, see fallacy number 1 about, okay, now you have an issue actually picking up on a difference that might be there and might add up over time throughout someone's training career. See fallacy number 3.
Right.
And they used MRI, which is great. See fallacy number 4. And the... Yeah, I think that's the way to go in research, but I think it just... When you see that, and then you put it through the lens that it is an isolated context, there was no hinging, and also it's not an either-or decision to use seated versus lying hamstring curls, it should just temper things down quite a bit.
Exactly.
And also, prone hamstring curls are so much better than seated
Really?
hamstring curls.
You like those?
I think they feel so much better to me.
Yeah, I don't totally disagrey. Seated hamstring curls are pretty.
I do both.
Pretty
hit
or miss, but
I do one on one day and the other on the other day. So
optimal.
But I
got to get those sartorials.
if I had to choose one, I'd definitely go prone. Like for the rest of my life, I'd definitely go prone.
I mean, and I think like again, it comes back to like what is the purpose of research here? And I think we've talked about this on a different podcast before, but to me, it's principles over methods. And I think if you view the hamstring study more from a principle-based perspective, I think if we go to apply it, it kind of makes sense that it isn't necessarily always better for a seated hamstring curl, at least in my opinion. That's more of an opinion-based matter. But like if the principle is more so talking about the muscle length, the resistance profile, et cetera, then you can kind of more so generalize that, obviously with some assumptions baked in. But if you're making those assumptions, you probably were like, oh, it's probably a little bit different if I'm already experiencing the hip hinging, and then you can apply it in a more nuanced way. Yeah. But the point of this fallacy is just that being aware of like how a early body of research operates in terms of setting up studies that are, generally speaking, more likely to show effects, and probably you're going to be on the higher end of what would be expected in an ecologically valid comparison, I think can help anchor your expectations a lot better for as an area of research develops, and make sure you don't have whiplash when you're like, oh my goodness, this is going to be this massive difference. And then the rest of the research comes out that have graded comparisons, just offer more data in general, anchor the effects better, more ecologically valid comparisons, train individuals, all the parts of the nuanced conversation that interpreting evidence is. But it's just realizing that the mechanisms of social media really, really reward these aspects of early bodies of research. And so triple checking yourself to realize this is kind of how the game goes, and you can point on pretty much any area of research. This is usually kind of how it develops, and you can kind of protect yourself against that. So I think if we had to sum up the 5 principles or 5 fallacies in general, it's have caution, generally speaking. We have less confidence than social media makes it seem, and just move slowly in terms of taking any one individual finding and going and applying it to your training. There's usually a level of filtering that needs to go through before a really well-informed application of the ideas happens, rather than just taking the study protocol and assuming that is going to, the exact manifestation of that protocol is going to optimize those things in real life. So, yeah. The only thing I'd add to that is I think it goes both ways. You mentioned don't get too fired up about a protocol that's like new, that we seem to have evidence for, even though it's fallen prey in terms of the interpretation to one or multiple of these fallacies. At the same time,
that's not evident. Just because these fallacies exist isn't evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, exactly. 100%.
And like you said that multiple times, but it's worth pointing out. It's not like it's
not a doomer on evidence.
It's not a doomer on evidence. Yeah. It's not a doomer on like learning. It's not a doomer on progression
keeping
or
up with
optimization.
Yeah.
I think it just is like a refreshing thing to realize that like the answer probably isn't out there for you to find. And again, just
when everybody's saying the same thing, that generally speaking, the people that are well informed, when everybody's saying very similar or the same thing, that's usually when there's an answer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if it's, very contextual.
Like the highest level principles, right? Like I guarantee you our volume meta-analysis is wrong in some way.
Yeah.
Right? If we double the number of data we have in it, it's going to change. It's wrong. Yeah. I don't know exactly where, but there's a reason there's credible intervals in terms of like where things could conceivably end up, and in theory they could even end up beyond that. So like I would even like put caution on those things and say like think one level above. What matters is like how do physiological systems adapt, right? And just like think about those things that are common across various bodies of research within our field and even outside of our field. Is that like you have to provide like overload is probably something I would say there's enough evidence that needs to be the case. And like it seems silly, but that can be your driving principle, like overload or specificity, right? I think sometimes you can get a little bit carried away with some of the individual implementations of things. And again, I would just say like at the same time, even though this stuff should humble you in terms of the things you think you can and can't say, it should also humble you to the contrary about what we don't know, and that there could be things that do have an effect that you shouldn't just ignore them or be lazy, right? So like let's say in theory we had a study showing that a group of people sleeping 6 hours versus 8 hours, the additional sleep didn't actually benefit you. This should also humble you to the fact that like sleep extension still might be an intervention.
Exactly.
We just don't know.
It's uncertainty.
It's uncertainty, and like there's reason to believe from some of those higher level principles I mentioned that like additional recovery from additional sleep would be beneficial. Because again, that's just something that I think in hindsight, and it's my error, it's no one else's error, but my error, is the way that I interpreted a lot of science communication early on. Is just like a lot of stuff doesn't matter.
Yep.
You can train in the 4 to 50 rep range.
Yeah, people don't realize that's just as positive a claim as saying there is a difference. That's the reality. Is like all of these fallacies are getting at is just to have a layer of caution and a layer of uncertainty, but that is not directional. That is simply a statement.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's not directional.
The uncertainty,
these fallacies don't shift you away from the strong claim or in the direction like toward the strong claim. It's
exactly.
You don't know.
Yeah, the uncertainty is not directional. It's just saying that we can, with certain claims we can be more confident in them, and other claims we can be less confident in them. And it's just understanding the framework in which determines that confidence. Mm-hmm. And all of these fallacies kind of give you an additional layer of interpretation to make sure that your confidence isn't greater than it should be, which is often overstated on social media. I think that's the case. When you see studies that are interpreted, these 5 layers of filtering and caution and additional uncertainty are kind of just blown past to make you think we have firm answers in either direction, whether that is saying things aren't different or things are different or something matters or it doesn't. But in reality, there are few and far between things where we have a level of confidence to make those claims. And like you said, even the highest levels of evidence, those have issues with them too. And this uncertainty shouldn't be crippling to me. That's like that's the ultimately this is just something everybody has to grow comfortable with over time. I think there's a even us as young scientists or young lifters that are looking for answers, there's a strong desire for certainty that unfortunately just isn't out there. And the more you can become comfortable as a probabilistic thinker, first and foremost, I think that helps you identify things that are really, really high ROI for you, which are kind of no-brainers, but it also allows you to be creative in spaces where there isn't answers. And that part of the creative process of lifting is one of the reasons we love it in the first place. Just because, there doesn't seem to be a benefit to sleep extension or whatever the theoretical...
Should be clear, hypothetical example.
Hypothetical example, that's probably not true. But take some theoretical example. You can still experiment with that. You can still do all these things in a scientific manner, and that is still a entirely valid application of quote-unquote science in general. It's not just research. Research gives us tools to evaluate principles that are more likely to generalize, but there's a large area of things that will never touch. And so I think being crippled by this uncertainty is definitely the wrong way to interpret it. And if anything, it should be more empowering to understand what things we have a lot of confidence for and what things we don't. And then you just have a sandbox for things to play with and try different things out and experience the process of lifting and not have too much FOMO or, think that there's all these hard lines in the sand when in reality, things are a little bit less clear than they may seem.
Yeah. Nailed it, man. I wish I would have listened to this 7 years ago.
Me too. I was writing it to myself, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Letter to my younger self. What do you think of the social media approach of strong claim on the front end?
Mm-hmm. Redirect?
What's that?
Like redirect, basically?
I don't know what you mean by that, but I'll finish what I was going to say. Strong claim on the front end. It's like 1 or 2 sentence hitter, right? Mm-hmm. New study finds blank. But then the nuance is there, but it's just kind of like, it's just not, most people aren't going to see it because they're not going to look past the first, slide or two of the Instagram post or past the title of the YouTube video. What do you think of that approach?
Depends on the goal. Honestly, it depends on your moral framework. If you are ultimately, if you zoom out all the way and you ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish with my science communication? If you're trying to make a net positive on the community or what you think is a positive effect on the community, then optimizing for that can look a lot of different ways. Yeah. And in reality, a lot of the approaches, and I know Dr. Helms has talked about this, like making some concessions in terms of what he would typically do to improve the thumbnail or improve things like that kind of seem maybe a little bit of a stride away from his typical way of going about things. And we've tried similar things for us. Like if that fundamentally takes what you poured your heart and soul into from a good piece of information from 20% to 100% engagement or reach or things like that from something you genuinely think is going to have a positive impact, I think you can make a compelling case from a consequentialist perspective. That's a net positive. But on the other end of things, if you take more so the line in the sand of I want to get as far as I can get with my core principles being held to 100%, and that's what you think is the right way to go about it, of saying I'm going to sacrifice some of the potential reach, and that's just the constraints on which I'm operating the game within, and you think that's the only ethical way to go about that game, then you can make a strong case that you're going to get where you're going to get by trying to approach things in as informational as entertaining of a way as possible by not playing any of these, there's a subjective demarcation of what is playing the game and what isn't. But I think there's literally no right answer to which one of those
right
two.
Answer,
but if you're asking me what my opinion is,
there's ways to kind of dance around it. Like you could ask a question. Yeah. Which isn't a claim by definition. That is very catchy. Yep. That can work at times. And kind of have your cake and eat it too. Yeah. Another approach is to make it more topic oriented, but make the kind of catch the hook, if you will, based on something you're missing out on, which is very common. And I'm no expert on this, but seems to be something that performs pretty well, is by making someone feel like if they don't have this information, they're going to miss out on something. You're making these 3 mistakes. Yep. And we've had videos that are titled like that as well, and probably will continue to. I could see someone make the claim that that is less ethical in a way, and less in alignment with the core values of science compared to making just a 1 or 2 sentence claim and then adding a bunch of context on the back end. So what I'm saying is it's messy, and said this at the very beginning of the show. Like, I pass very little judgment these days.
It's hard.
Because it's hard.
It's hard. I think ultimately for me, the ultimate guiding compass that I have, at least for myself, is that if the entire context is there, I can sleep at night.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to, is like,
you can point back to something.
Exactly.
Like, we recorded that 5-hour podcast on volume and hypertrophy because we knew it was going to be discussed quite a bit.
Yep.
We knew there would be like critiques, and we wanted to basically be the first ones to say those critiques.
Yep.
So like very few people are going to see that. I think, you know, however many thousands of people, it's not nearly as many people that have been exposed to the paper in general, let alone the people that got to the 5-hour mark. But you can at least, like you said, sleep at night knowing that if you really wanted to, you could point someone to that timestamp because it was said there.
Exactly. And so that, to me, that is showing that you have the intention of being ethical, helpful, and providing the full story.
Balanced.
Exactly. You're doing your due diligence, but then the issue, like the part that I have, is like, it gets very messy when you realize it's not just the game of like putting positive information out into the world. I wish that were the case, but you're also to some degree fighting the alternative of less nuanced information and those kind of things. And if they are like, it's like bringing your fist to a gunfight. Like, if you literally have none of the tricks of the trade to get engagement, to have high watch times, to, you know, get the followings that are necessary to get the quote unquote correct information, obviously we're wrong sometimes, out into the world, then you're just literally playing handicapped. And it's like, do you really, this is the...
Oh, you want to talk about natural versus enhanced bodybuilding?
Yeah. Like, and here's this can come across wrong, but I don't mean it like this, like we're not special, but like, if you genuinely think we have positive information to provide to the world, then by not playing that game, do you have a net negative effect because you're allowing disinformation or misinformation to populate and spread? Then you have to take that into mind too. So it's not just the fact that you are not using the tools to be less effective. It's you're potentially being harmful if you have, if you're something that you think could strongly benefit the community and you're letting the record go uncorrected and you're not utilizing the tools necessary to make sure the record gets corrected, you could make the argument that that's immoral. So at the end of the day, to me, the only thing that I can say confidently is that I'm going to put my best foot forward in terms of what I think is truly the case, full nuance, full context, and then the rest of it we're just trying to figure out with all those other things and all those considerations. And it's a constant evolving journey, but the way I can sleep at night is like, I think people can look at our content for the most part, you know, barring the weird comment here and there, but for the most part can tell that we're genuinely trying to do our best and genuinely trying to leave the field a better place than we found it, and trying to address a lot of things that our younger selves would benefit from, and try to be a net positive and do that as, you know, professional and kind way as possible, I guess, for lack of a better term. And the other aspects of the things you can probably see definitely make my skin crawl, is kind of just a necessary evil to exist in this world and the way that things are headed.
Yeah, that's good stuff, man.
Yeah.
So with that, make sure you subscribe. But if you subscribe, tell a friend to unsubscribe so we stay at 10,000 subscribers, because that's the optimal point. Yep. We'll continue to try our best on this podcast, on this YouTube channel. That said, we're human. You know, if the gym's busy and someone's using the lat pull down for too long, I'm going to get irritable. Yep. And that's just that. So we appreciate everyone tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Season 2, Episode 10 is coming your way at some point. We'll see you next time.
Peace.